The first rule was silence. Not spoken aloud, but understood the moment a girl learned to sit still without fidgeting, to lower her eyes before they wandered too far, to breathe shallowly so her corset would not betray her thoughts. In Victorian high society, a woman was expected to be seen but never fully felt. Every gesture was rehearsed, every smile timed, every misstep quietly remembered. A wrong glance could ruin a reputation. Walking too quickly suggested desperation. Laughing too freely hinted at moral looseness. Even hunger was something to be hidden, managed, denied. Etiquette was not about politeness, it was a finely tuned discipline, designed to shape women into symbols of restraint, purity, and control, no matter the cost to their bodies or minds. Before we go any further, take a moment to like the video, subscribe, and tell me where you're listening from tonight. It helps this quiet corner of history reach others who still feel drawn to its shadows. Because tonight, we're uncovering the strangest, most unsettling etiquette rules Victorian high society women were forced to follow. Rules so rigid, so unnatural, they reveal not elegance, but fear. A world where good manners were a mask, and breaking them could cost everything. Before a Victorian girl was ever corrected, she was trained to be quiet, not through scolding or threat, but through atmosphere, through rooms that rewarded stillness and punished movement, through glances that lingered just long enough to teach shame without explanation. Silence came first, settling over childhood like a veil, preparing the ground long before rules were spoken aloud. In respectable homes, noise was a form of disorder. A child who spoke too loudly, laughed too freely, or moved too suddenly was gently but firmly redirected. Hands were folded, feet were placed together, backs were straightened without comment. The lesson was absorbed not as a command, but as instinct. Do not draw attention to yourself. Do not intrude upon the room. Do not announce your presence. A girl learned that approval arrived quietly, and disapproval arrived quieter still. There were no manuals handed to children outlining their future restraints. Instead, behavior was shaped through observation. Girls watched their mothers glide through parlors with measured steps, heard conversations pause when they entered a room, felt the subtle shift when adult eyes turned toward them. They learned quickly which questions were answered and which dissolved into polite evasion. Curiosity, if it strayed too far, was not encouraged. It was ignored. This early silence served a purpose. It taught anticipation. A girl learned to read the room before acting, to sense when speech might be tolerated and when it might mark her as ill-bred. She learned that restraint was not weakness, but survival. In a society where reputation could be undone without evidence, silence became a shield. Education reinforced this quiet discipline. Young ladies were taught accomplishments, music, drawing, embroidery, but rarely encouraged to display ambition or independent thought. These skills were meant to occupy the hands and soften the presence, not to challenge or express. A well-trained girl performed without demanding attention, her talents offered as ornament rather than voice. Praise, when it came, was gentle and conditional, never enough to suggest confidence was deserved. Even play was regulated. Games that involved rough movement, raised voices, or visible exertion were discouraged. A flushed face hinted at excess. Breathlessness suggested loss of control. Girls learned early that their bodies were something to be monitored, kept within acceptable limits. To be still was to be safe. To be quiet was to be good. This conditioning followed them into adolescence, where silence hardened into expectation. A young woman entering society was not expected to speak first, ask direct questions, or reveal inner thoughts. Her role was to listen, to respond pleasantly, to mirror the tone of those around her without imposing her own. Silence became a mark of refinement. A woman who spoke sparingly was praised for modesty. One who spoke freely risked suspicion. What made this silence particularly effective was its invisibility. because it arrived before instruction, it felt natural. By the time rules were explicitly stated how to sit, how to speak, how to behave, a woman had already internalized obedience. The groundwork had been laid in childhood, in quiet rooms and unspoken corrections. Etiquette did not need to be enforced loudly. It was already living inside her. This was the Victorian method at its most efficient. Control without confrontation. Compliance without resistance. By teaching silence first, society ensured that when the rules arrived, they would not be questioned. They would feel inevitable. And so, before the gloves, before the corsets, before the endless regulations governing every breath and gesture, there was this initial lesson: be quiet, be watchful, be contained. The rest would follow naturally. In Victorian high society, the female body was never neutral. It was watched, measured, corrected, and quietly feared. From the moment a girl became aware of her physical presence, she was taught that her body was not simply hers to inhabit. It was something that could betray her, expose her character, and invite judgment without her ever speaking a word. Movement itself was suspect. A woman who walked too quickly appeared nervous or eager. One who moved too slowly risked seeming idle or affected. Every gesture carried meaning, whether intended or not. A hand raised too high, a step taken too wide, a shoulder turned at the wrong angle. Each could be interpreted as carelessness, immodesty, or worse. The body was a text constantly being read by others, and any deviation from the expected script could mark a woman as improperly raised. Victorian etiquette manuals rarely spoke openly about fear, yet fear underpinned them all. The fear that a woman's body might reveal desire, the fear that comfort might lead to indulgence, the fear that physical ease could unravel moral discipline. As a result, the body was treated as something to be restrained rather than trusted. Clothing was designed not merely for fashion, but for control. Layers restricted movement. Fabrics weighed the body down. Shoes limited stride. Even warmth and breath were carefully moderated. Girls were taught early to monitor themselves. Sit up straight. Keep your knees together. Do not lean. Do not stretch. Do not fidget. Comfort was irrelevant. Appearance was everything. Physical discomfort was reframed as refinement. Endurance became a quiet virtue. A woman who could tolerate pain without complaint was admired, her silence mistaken for strength rather than conditioning. The natural functions of the body were handled with particular delicacy. Hunger was embarrassing. Fatigue was weakness. Illness, unless dramatic enough to warrant fainting, was best concealed. To acknowledge bodily needs was to draw attention to physicality, and physicality was dangerously close to desire. Even pregnancy, undeniable as it was treated as something to be hidden for as long as possible, spoken of only in euphemism or not at all. Victorian society insisted on presenting women as ethereal, delicate, almost bodiless, yet paradoxically demanded relentless bodily discipline. This contradiction created a constant tension. A woman was expected to appear fragile while enduring extraordinary physical strain. Corsets compressed organs. Heavy skirts dragged across floors and streets alike. Long hours were spent standing, sitting, or performing social rituals without rest. The body was expected to obey without protest. Any loss of control, however small, carried social risk. A flushed face could suggest improper excitement. Perspiration hinted at exertion, unbecoming of a lady. Visible breathlessness implied effort, and effort implied labor, a dangerous association in a class system built on separation from work. To appear physically taxed was to blur the line between refinement and necessity. Medical language of the era reinforced this view. Women were frequently described as constitutionally weaker, more prone to imbalance, hysteria, or collapse. Yet, instead of easing expectations, this belief justified further restriction. The female body was seen as unstable, requiring constant supervision and correction. Rest was prescribed not for relief, but to maintain social order. Medication dulled sensation. Ether and laudanum softened resistance. Physical discomfort was not solved, it was managed, quieted, made invisible. Over time, women internalized this vigilance. They learned to inhabit their bodies cautiously, as if any unguarded moment might expose them. The body became something to negotiate rather than experience. Every day was a quiet performance of containment. Each movement weighed against unseen rules. In this way, the Victorian woman's body became a liability, not because it was unruly, but because society insisted it was. And so it was disciplined relentlessly, not to protect women from harm, but to protect the social order from them. The corset was never just clothing. It was a philosophy stitched into whalebone and silk, a belief system tightened daily until it shaped not only the body, but the self. In Victorian high society, the corset stood as proof that a woman could be controlled by herself, by others, by the invisible rules that governed her existence. From girlhood onward, tightening began gradually, not to shock the body, but to persuade it. Mothers and dressmakers assured young girls that discomfort would pass, that posture would improve, that virtue itself required adjustment. Each small constriction was framed as refinement. Pain was not named as pain, it was called improvement. To resist was to admit weakness of character. A properly corseted woman moved differently. Her steps shortened, her breath lifted higher in her chest, her spine remained unnaturally straight, her shoulders held back in a posture that suggested confidence while enforcing restraint. Sitting required care. Bending was an exercise in calculation. Even turning one's head became deliberate. The body, once flexible and expressive, was reorganized into a narrow range of acceptable motion. This restriction was praised as elegance. A small waist signaled discipline. It suggested moral fortitude, family respectability, and social worth. To endure tight lacing without complaint was admired, particularly among the upper classes, where physical labor was despised and bodily endurance paradoxically celebrated. A woman who fainted was pitied. A woman who complained was judged. The corset also served a deeper, unspoken function. It erased signs of appetite. A compressed torso discouraged eating, softened hunger, and reduced visible desire. In this way, the corset aligned neatly with broader expectations of female restraint. A woman should not want too much food, space, attention, or autonomy. Her body was expected to reflect that moderation. Medical warnings did exist. Doctors noted displaced organs, restricted breathing, weakened muscles. Yet these concerns rarely outweighed social expectation. Health was negotiable, reputation was not. A woman with a visibly relaxed figure risked speculation about her upbringing, her morals, even her sexual nature. Better to endure discomfort than suspicion. Corsets were fastened daily, often by another woman, mother, maid, sister. This ritual reinforced hierarchy and surveillance. Few women laced themselves fully. Independence was neither practical nor encouraged. The act itself became a quiet submission, repeated morning after morning, a reminder that the body was not entirely one's own. Even moments of privacy were shaped by this architecture. Sleep was lighter, breath remained shallow, the body never fully relaxed. Over time, many women reported dizziness, weakness, a sense of detachment. These symptoms were rarely linked to clothing. Instead, they were attributed to delicate nerves or feminine constitution, reinforcing the very beliefs that demanded further restraint. And yet, within this rigid structure, women learned endurance. They learned how to move gracefully within confinement, how to appear serene while managing constant physical strain. This adaptability was celebrated as feminine virtue, even as it masked the cost. The corset became a symbol not of fragility, but of enforced resilience. It is telling that when Victorian society spoke of moral backbone, it often did so literally. Upright posture reflected upright character. A controlled body implied a controlled mind. The corset thus became moral architecture, shaping flesh to fit an ideal that prized restraint above comfort, appearance above well-being. Long after the corset was loosened or abandoned, its influence lingered. The idea that discipline should hurt, that beauty requires suffering, that the body must be mastered rather than trusted, these lessons survived the garment itself. And so, beneath the layers of silk and steel, the corset left its deepest mark, not on the waist, but on how women were taught to inhabit their own bodies. Breath, in Victorian high society, was not a neutral act. It was watched, interpreted, and quietly judged. A woman's breathing was expected to be shallow, controlled, almost imperceptible, another private function made public, another reminder that even the most basic acts of living were subject to etiquette. To breathe deeply was to suggest exertion. Exertion implied labor, and labor was incompatible with refinement. A woman of status was not meant to appear physically taxed by her own existence. Her body should move through rooms as if untouched by effort, her chest rising subtly, her face calm, untroubled. Any visible struggle for air hinted at something improper beneath the surface. Corsets enforced this discipline mechanically. Tight lacing restricted the lower lungs, forcing breath upward into the chest. This was not an unfortunate side effect. It was part of the desired effect. Shallow breathing kept the body composed, the waist narrow, the movements minimal. A deep inhale would have disrupted the entire structure, physically and symbolically. Victorian etiquette manuals rarely mentioned breathing directly, yet they were obsessed with its consequences. A woman who sighed was assumed to be bored or dissatisfied. One who panted after climbing stairs appeared undignified. Breathlessness suggested excitement, whether physical or emotional, and excitement in women was treated with suspicion. Calm was not merely preferred, it was enforced. This expectation shaped how women moved through the world. Stairs were climbed slowly. Walking was measured. Sudden movement was avoided. Even dancing, one of the few socially acceptable forms of exertion, was tightly choreographed to maintain an appearance of ease. A woman who appeared winded after a dance risked subtle ridicule. Grace was defined not by skill, but by the absence of visible strain. The fear surrounding breath extended into emotion. Strong feeling caused changes in respiration, quickening, catching, sighing. For this reason, emotional restraint was intertwined with physical control. A woman learned to suppress not only her thoughts, but the bodily signals that accompanied them. To feel deeply was dangerous. It might show. Medical discourse reinforced these anxieties. Women were described as nervous, excitable, prone to hysteria, a condition often linked to irregular breathing. Rather than questioning the constraints placed upon women's bodies, physicians prescribed calm, rest, and sedation. Ether, laudanum, and other substances dulled sensation and slowed respiration, restoring the appearance of composure. Breath was managed chemically when etiquette alone was insufficient. Fainting became a strange exception to this rule. A woman who collapsed entirely was forgiven in ways a woman who breathed too deeply was not. Fainting was theatrical, contained, and socially legible. It suggested delicacy rather than exertion. Breathlessness without collapse, however, suggested failure, an inability to maintain control. Over time, women internalized these expectations. Many learned to breathe quietly, automatically, without conscious effort. Others lived in a state of perpetual dizziness, their oxygen restricted but unremarked. Complaints were dismissed as nerves. Weakness was reframed as femininity. The body adapted, but at a cost. What is striking is how closely morality was tied to respiration. A woman who breathed calmly was considered virtuous, steady, well-bred. One whose breath betrayed exertion or emotion was suspect. Even illness had to be managed discreetly. Coughing, wheezing, or labored breathing were embarrassing intrusions into public space, reminders of the body's refusal to remain invisible. In this way, breath itself became another etiquette rule, unwritten, yet deeply enforced. Women were taught not merely how to sit, stand, or speak, but how to inhale and exhale within acceptable limits. Life was lived carefully, measured in shallow breaths. And so, in parlors heavy with perfume and gaslight, surrounded by fabrics that restricted movement and air alike, Victorian women learned one of the strangest lessons of all, that even breathing too deeply could be a social transgression. A woman's eyes, in Victorian high society, were considered far more revealing than her voice. Where speech could be controlled and silence enforced, the gaze was treacherous, quick to wander, slow to forget, and capable of expressing thoughts etiquette demanded remain buried. For this reason, one of the earliest and most enduring lessons taught to women was simple: lower your eyes. Direct eye contact carried weight. To look too long suggested interest. To look too openly implied confidence. To meet a man's gaze without invitation risked being read as flirtation, challenge, or moral recklessness. Respectable women learned to let their eyes drift downward or sideways, never settling, never holding. The correct gaze was brief, modest, and easily withdrawn. This was not shyness, it was discipline. Girls were trained early in this silent choreography. When spoken to by elders, they were expected to look attentive, but not bold. When introduced to strangers, their eyes flickered up just long enough to acknowledge presence before retreating. Prolonged eye contact was corrected gently at first, then more firmly. A girl who stared was not curious, she was ill-mannered. The logic behind this rule was rarely articulated, yet it was deeply ingrained. The gaze was believed to invite intimacy. Looking implied wanting, and wanting implied desire. Desire in women was considered dangerous, destabilizing, and in need of constant containment. By controlling the eyes, society believed it could control the mind. Public spaces intensified this scrutiny. On promenades, in drawing rooms, at social gatherings, a woman's gaze was expected to remain carefully managed. She was permitted to observe without appearing to observe. Looking directly at people, especially men, was risky. Looking too freely at one's surroundings suggested curiosity, independence, and a lack of modest reserve. Even mirrors were suspect. Spending too long examining one's reflection was considered vanity, a sign of moral weakness. A woman might adjust her appearance, but she was not to admire it. Self-awareness, like desire, was to be minimized. Etiquette manuals instructed women to rest the eyes gently and avoid bold glances, phrases that disguised surveillance as refinement. These instructions were reinforced socially. Women watched one another closely, noting who looked too long, who met gazes too confidently, who appeared too aware of being seen. Judgment passed silently, but swiftly. The lowered gaze also reinforced hierarchy. Women were expected to look up only when addressed, and even then briefly. In mixed company, men surveyed the room while women occupied it discreetly. Looking down signaled deference not just to individuals, but to the structure itself. It affirmed that women were present, but not observing subjects. This discipline carried psychological weight. Over time, women learned to experience the world indirectly. They absorbed details through peripheral vision, through reflections, through fragments. They became skilled at noticing without acknowledging, seeing without being seen. Yet, this skill came at a cost. It trained women to doubt their own perceptions, to avoid asserting what they noticed, to exist slightly outside their own experience. There were consequences for disobedience. A woman who met eyes too readily might find herself whispered about, her intentions would be questioned, her virtue subtly doubted. Even if nothing improper occurred, the suggestion alone was damaging. Reputation depended not on action, but on appearance, and the gaze was appearance made visible. In moments of emotional intensity, anger, excitement, attraction, the eyes were the first to betray. For this reason, women learned to school their expressions carefully. Feeling had to be muted, interest disguised. The face became another surface to manage, another site of restraint. By insisting that women lower their eyes, Victorian society ensured they would also lower their expectations. The rule did more than regulate behavior. It shaped identity. A woman learned not only where to look, but how little she was permitted to see openly. And so, beneath chandeliers and gaslight, surrounded by watchful faces, women learned the art of looking away. Not because they were uninterested, but because seeing too clearly was never considered safe. A smile, in Victorian high society, was never merely an expression. It was a signal carefully read, quietly interpreted, and often mistrusted. For women, smiling without clear cause or permission carried risk. It suggested openness where reserve was expected, warmth where cool composure was prized. A woman's mouth, like her eyes, was expected to obey rules rarely written but always enforced. Girls learned early that a pleasant expression was required, but enthusiasm was not. The correct smile was restrained, fleeting, and responsive rather than spontaneous. One smiled when addressed, when acknowledged, when spoken to kindly. Smiling on one's own without prompt, without visible reason, invited speculation. What was she pleased about? Whom was she encouraging? What thoughts lay behind that unguarded curve of the lips? In a culture obsessed with moral signals, the smile became suspicious precisely because it was small. It was intimate. It suggested inner life. And inner life in women was something Victorian society preferred to keep obscure. A broad smile was especially dangerous. It hinted at excess feeling, perhaps even sensuality. Laughter already hovered on the edge of impropriety. A wide smile suggested it might escape at any moment. Women were expected to appear agreeable without appearing delighted. Content, but not joyful. Calm, but not animated. The line between acceptable pleasantness and unacceptable eagerness was thin, and women were expected to feel it instinctively. Etiquette guides advised women to maintain gentle composure, a phrase that disguised strict emotional regulation as elegance. Facial expression was to mirror circumstance, never exceed it. If a joke was told, a smile might follow, but quietly. If good news was shared, gratitude could be shown, but modestly. Emotional economy was a virtue. Display was not. Smiling at the wrong person carried particular risk. A woman who smiled too readily at men, especially outside her immediate circle, risked being labeled forward. The smile could be interpreted as encouragement, an invitation that etiquette insisted women must never issue directly. Even if the intention was politeness, perception mattered more. Reputation turned on how actions were read, not how they were meant. As a result, women learned to neutralize their faces. Expressions softened, smiles became carefully rationed. Many adopted a mild, almost blank, pleasantness that revealed nothing. This was praised as dignity. A woman who mastered it was considered well-bred, safe, and respectable. The cost of this discipline was subtle but real. Smiling is a social reflex, an instinctive response to warmth, humor, connection. To suppress it required constant awareness, a monitoring of one's own face, even in moments of ease. Over time, this vigilance dulled spontaneity. Women learned to experience pleasure inwardly, cautiously, or not at all. There were moments when smiling was not only permitted but required. At social events, hostesses were expected to project warmth without intimacy. Brides were expected to appear serene rather than ecstatic. Mothers were to smile softly, never exuberantly. Each role came with its own narrow range of acceptable expression. Outside it, judgment waited. Medical thinkers of the era sometimes warned against excessive emotion, claiming it strained women's delicate nerves. This belief reinforced the etiquette surrounding expression. A woman who smiled too much was not only improper, she was unbalanced. Emotional moderation was framed as health. In this way, the smile became another controlled surface. Like posture, breath, and gaze, it was shaped by expectation. Women learned not only when to smile, but when not to. They learned that joy, like desire, should be contained. And so, in parlors filled with conversation and courtesy, women learned to keep their faces composed, their mouths quiet, their pleasure subdued. Smiling was allowed, but only when invited, only when safe, only when it revealed nothing more than what society was willing to see. Laughter was the sound Victorian society feared most when it came from a woman. Not because it was loud, though volume mattered, but because it was uncontrollable. It arrived suddenly, broke composure, and exposed feeling in a way etiquette could not easily restrain. For this reason, female laughter was treated not as joy, but as risk. A woman was permitted to smile. She was even permitted a soft chuckle, carefully contained behind a gloved hand. But true laughter, open, audible, unguarded, was another matter entirely. It disrupted the illusion of restraint upon which respectability depended. A laughing woman appeared animated, present, embodied. She took up space with sound, and sound, like movement, drew attention. Victorian etiquette manuals spoke of laughter obliquely, often warning against excessive mirth or unseemly amusement. The implication was clear. Laughter suggested loss of self-control, a temporary abandonment of the discipline that defined femininity. It hinted at appetite, emotional, social, even sexual. A woman who laughed freely was assumed to feel freely, and that was precisely the problem. Girls learned this lesson early. A burst of laughter in the nursery might be indulged. The same sound in the drawing room was corrected with a look. As girls grew older, correction became more subtle. A raised eyebrow, a pause in conversation. The sudden coolness of adults who had moments earlier seemed pleased. The message required no explanation. That sound does not belong here. By adolescence, most young women understood instinctively when laughter was safe. In private, among close female companions, it might escape quick, breathless, guilty. In public, it was carefully managed. If laughter occurred, it was softened, abbreviated, apologized for with a phrase or gesture that reasserted control. "Forgive me," the body language said, even when no words were spoken. The danger of laughter lay not only in its volume, but in its association with class. Working-class women were often caricatured as loud, boisterous, unrestrained. High society defined itself in opposition to this image. Quietness signaled refinement. A woman who laughed too openly risked being aligned with those below her station, regardless of birth. There was also the matter of gendered power. Laughter can undermine authority. It punctures seriousness. A woman who laughed at the wrong moment during a man's speech, at an inappropriate remark, could be seen as disrespectful or insolent. Even when laughter was prompted by genuine humor, its social meaning mattered more than its cause. For men, laughter could signal confidence, wit, command of the room. For women, it was often interpreted as nervousness or frivolity. A laughing woman was not taken seriously. Her intelligence might be questioned, her maturity doubted. In extreme cases, her morals scrutinized. Laughter marked her as someone not fully in control of herself. Medical discourse again offered justification. Women were described as excitable, prone to emotional excess. Laughter, like tears, was framed as a symptom of instability rather than expression. Restraint was prescribed not only socially, but medically. Calmness was health. Quiet was virtue. Over time, Many women learned to replace laughter with polite acknowledgement, a smile, a nod, a murmured appreciation. The physical impulse to laugh was suppressed, redirected, internalized. Some women later described a sense of tightness, a feeling of holding something back, even in moments of happiness. Joy, when contained too long, does not disappear, it hardens. There were moments when laughter was permitted, even expected. At carefully orchestrated social gatherings, a gentle ripple of amusement might pass through the room, tightly regulated by context and company. But even then, it was never to linger, never to escalate, never to belong fully to the woman herself. In this way, laughter became another boundary, a reminder that even happiness had limits, that pleasure must be quiet, brief, and easily silenced. Victorian society did not forbid women from laughing outright, it simply made the cost of doing so too high. And so, many learned to swallow laughter as it rose, to smile instead, to let the moment pass. Joy was allowed, but only in measured doses, carefully hidden, never loud enough to threaten the fragile order of restraint. In Victorian high society, walking was never simply movement from one place to another. It was a performance, a visible measure of upbringing, morality, and control. Every step a woman took was read as a statement, and the space she occupied, or failed to occupy, was carefully judged. A respectable woman did not stride, she glided. Her pace was neither hurried nor languid, neither eager nor idle. Walking too quickly suggested anxiety, impatience, or desperation, an unbecoming urgency that hinted at inner disorder. Walking too slowly risked appearing affected, indulgent, or inattentive to the social rhythm around her. The correct pace was narrow, and women were expected to find it instinctively. Distance mattered just as much as speed. How close a woman walked beside another person carried meaning. Too near a man suggested intimacy. Too far implied coldness or impropriety. Even among women, spacing was regulated. Crowding suggested familiarity that might invite gossip. Excessive distance hinted at arrogance or aloofness. The body, moving through public space, was required to observe invisible boundaries that shifted depending on company, location, and circumstance. Promenades were the ultimate test of this discipline. Public walking spaces, parks, gardens, fashionable streets were arenas of observation. To walk there was to be seen, assessed, and remembered. Women did not simply stroll, they displayed composure. Steps were short, controlled by restrictive clothing and reinforced by expectation. Arms remained close to the body. Hands were occupied by parasols, gloves, or companions to prevent aimless motion. Walking alone was particularly fraught. A woman unaccompanied in public space invited scrutiny regardless of her intent. Why was she alone? Where was she going? Respectable women were expected to be escorted, especially in busy or mixed company. Solitude suggested vulnerability at best and impropriety at worst. Even a short walk without company could provoke speculation. Chaperones enforced distance as much as propriety. A woman walking with a man was expected to maintain a precise, spatial relationship, close enough to converse, distant enough to prevent any impression of intimacy. Hands were never to brush, arms never to touch. Accidental contact was treated with exaggerated formality to reassure observers that nothing improper had occurred. Stairs, corridors, and entrances presented their own challenges. A woman was expected to ascend and descend carefully, neither rushing ahead nor lagging behind. Leading was bold. Following too closely was suggestive. Even the simple act of passing through a doorway carried instruction. Pause, allow others precedence, never appear impatient. Movement was constantly moderated by awareness of others' eyes. The rules governing walking extended into posture. A straight back signaled discipline. A lowered head suggested modesty. Looking around too freely risked appearing curious or bold. The walk itself became an extension of the lowered gaze, the shallow breath, the controlled smile. Everything moved together, choreographed into restraint. Physical discomfort was ignored. Long skirts dragged against pavement, shoes pinched, corsets restricted stride. None of this was acknowledged. To appear physically burdened by walking was to admit bodily reality, and bodily reality undermined the illusion of effortless refinement. A woman was expected to move as if unaffected by the constraints imposed upon her. These rules were not merely about politeness, they were about containment. Walking defined how much space a woman was permitted to occupy in the world. Her movement was minimized, softened, narrowed. She learned to take up as little room as possible, both physically and socially. The correct distance was not just between bodies, but between womanhood and autonomy. Over time, women internalized this spatial caution. Many learned to calculate their presence automatically, adjusting their pace and position without conscious thought. The world became a series of measured paths rather than open ground. Freedom of movement was replaced by navigation. In this way, walking became another silent lesson. A woman learned not only how to move, but how far she was allowed to go, how close, how fast, how visible. The path she walked was never entirely her own. In Victorian high society, solitude was rarely interpreted as independence. For women, it was read as exposure. A woman alone in public space was not admired for her autonomy. She was questioned for her vulnerability. Why was she unaccompanied? Who had allowed it? What circumstances had placed her beyond supervision? These questions lingered long after she passed. From early girlhood, respectability was tied to presence, specifically the presence of others, mothers, sisters, aunts, companions, governesses, later chaperones. A woman was expected to move through the world buffered by watchful figures, each one reinforcing the idea that she was not meant to navigate public life alone. Supervision was framed as care, but it functioned as containment. To walk alone was to invite interpretation. Even if nothing improper occurred, the appearance itself was enough to spark speculation. A lone woman on a street, in a park, or entering a public building unsettled Victorian sensibilities. It suggested that boundaries had been crossed, that oversight had failed. Respectability relied not only on behavior, but on the visible presence of restraint. This expectation applied unevenly across class, but its logic remained consistent. Upper-class women were rarely expected to be unaccompanied at all. Their visibility alone marked them as subjects of scrutiny. Middle-class women might move independently for errands or family duties, but even then, their routes and timing were carefully managed. Prolonged or aimless walking was suspect. Purpose mattered. Chaperonage became the formal expression of this rule. A chaperone was not merely company, she was a social safeguard. Her presence validated the woman she accompanied, signaling to observers that everything was in order. Conversations, glances, pauses, all were filtered through this third party. The chaperone existed to absorb risk, to stand between a woman and misinterpretation. Young women felt this constraint most sharply. Entering society meant being watched more closely than ever before. A girl might enjoy relative freedom within the home, but once her reputation mattered, once marriage prospects emerged, her movements narrowed. A walk required planning, a visit required approval. Even brief errands could become negotiations. The idea that a woman required accompaniment rested on a belief that the world itself was dangerous and that women were responsible for managing that danger by limiting their presence within it. Men's behavior was rarely questioned, women's visibility was. If harm occurred, scrutiny fell not on circumstance, but on the woman's decision to be there at all. This logic extended beyond safety into morality. A woman who walked alone too often might be perceived as seeking attention. Independence was recast as impropriety. Confidence became recklessness. The line between freedom and suspicion was thin, and women were expected to sense it instinctively. Even within acceptable contexts, solitude was discouraged. A woman might sit alone briefly, but prolonged isolation appeared melancholy or odd. Social engagement was expected, but only within sanctioned bounds. To choose solitude was to step outside the role assigned to her present, pleasant, and observed. The internal effects of this rule were subtle but lasting. Many women learned to distrust their own desire for space. Wanting to walk alone felt transgressive, selfish, even dangerous. The world became something to navigate through others rather than directly. Independence, when it appeared, often arrived tinged with guilt. There were exceptions, of course. Widows moved more freely, older women gained latitude, yet even these freedoms were conditional, granted not as rights but as allowances. Youth, beauty, and perceived vulnerability tightened restrictions rather than loosening them. The rule against walking alone did more than limit movement, it shaped identity. It taught women that safety came from compliance, that visibility required permission, that freedom was something one earned through age or sacrifice. The public world was never fully theirs. And so, Victorian women learned to move in pairs or groups, their steps synchronized, their presence softened by company. Alone, they were questioned. Together, they were contained. The rule was simple, rarely stated, and deeply enforced. Never walk alone, not because you cannot, but because you are not meant to. Touch, in Victorian high society, was never casual. It carried meaning, implication, and consequence. For women especially, physical contact was tightly regulated, parceled into acceptable forms and forbidden gestures. Among these, the handshake stood in a strange and uneasy place, ordinary, public, and yet profoundly suspect when offered by a woman. The handshake was associated with equality. It implied mutual recognition, directness, and a certain social confidence. These qualities were acceptable, even admirable. In men, in women, they were troubling. A woman who extended her hand too readily risked appearing forward, assertive, or unfamiliar with her place. Touch, initiated by a woman, unsettled a hierarchy built on restraint and distance. Etiquette manuals offered vague guidance, often advising women to allow men to initiate physical greetings, if such contact occurred at all. In many circles, women did not shake hands routinely. Instead, greetings were conducted through bows, nods, or verbal acknowledgement. The absence of touch was not awkward, it was correct. Distance preserved propriety. When a handshake did occur, it was brief and carefully executed. Gloves remained on, pressure was minimal, eye contact was fleeting. The gesture was meant to conclude before it could suggest familiarity. Any warmth beyond this narrow range risked interpretation. A lingering touch, a firm grip, or an unguarded smile transformed politeness into something else entirely. The concern was not purely physical. Touch suggested connection. Connection implied intimacy. Intimacy, outside carefully managed relationships, threatened reputation. A woman's body was already burdened with meaning. Contact only intensified scrutiny. Even accidental brushes of hands could provoke embarrassment or apology, reinforcing the idea that touch was inherently dangerous. This caution extended beyond men. Even among women, touch was moderated. Close embraces were reserved for family or intimate friendship. Public affection was restrained. Too much familiarity suggested emotional excess. Physical distance mirrored emotional control. The handshake's ambiguity made it particularly fraught. It was neither overtly intimate nor entirely impersonal. It occupied a liminal space. Victorian society preferred women avoid. Women were expected to receive gestures, not initiate them. Agency in physical interaction was quietly discouraged. This rule also reinforced broader patterns of passivity. By limiting a woman's ability to initiate touch, Society reinforced the idea that she should wait to be addressed, invited, guided. Touch became another domain where action was constrained and response was preferred. In professional or intellectual settings, the absence of the handshake had practical consequences. As women began to appear rarely in public roles, their inability to engage in standard social gestures marked them as outsiders. The simple act of greeting became a reminder of exclusion. Equality was not only denied in law or opportunity, but in the smallest rituals of interaction. Medical and moral beliefs again provided justification. Touch was thought to excite nerves, stir emotion, disrupt composure. Women, believed to be more sensitive, were therefore protected from excessive contact. This protection, like so many others, functioned as restriction. Over time, many women internalized this caution. They learned to hold their hands still, occupied, gloved. They learned to receive rather than offer. The body became something to manage carefully in social space, its boundaries policed both externally and within. The forbidden handshake was never truly banned. It was simply made risky. Its meaning was never fixed, only implied. And so women learned to avoid it not because it was wrong, but because it was uncertain. Uncertainty was dangerous in a world where reputation depended on clarity. In this way, even the smallest gesture became charged. A hand extended could speak too loudly. A touch could say too much. Victorian women learned, once again, that silence and stillness were safer than action, and that keeping one's hands to oneself was not just manners, but survival. Gloves were never merely accessories in Victorian high society. They were boundaries made visible, soft, elegant, and absolute. To wear gloves was to declare oneself civilized, contained, and properly raised. To remove them at the wrong moment was to risk exposure far greater than bare skin alone could suggest. From childhood, girls were taught that hands were revealing. They touched, gestured, reached. They betrayed intention and emotion more easily than words. Gloves muted this expressiveness. They softened movement, dulled sensation, and reminded both wearer and observer that contact was regulated. A gloved hand was a controlled hand. Etiquette demanded that women wear gloves in public, almost without exception. Streets, drawing rooms, visits, social gatherings all required them. Even indoors, gloves often remained on until a specific social cue permitted removal. The moment of ungloving was itself ritualized, governed by rules of company, status, and propriety. To remove gloves too soon suggested comfort where distance was expected. To keep them on too long could imply coldness or ignorance of custom. The glove served as a barrier not only against dirt, but against implication. A bare hand was intimate. It could feel warmth, texture, pressure. A gloved hand remained neutral. When physical contact occurred, an accidental brush, a formal greeting, the glove absorbed meaning, along with sensation. Touch was filtered, made safer, less personal. This was particularly important in interactions between men and women. A gloved hand ensured that even permitted contact remained symbolic rather than felt. It reassured observers that boundaries had not been crossed. Even within marriage, public touch was moderated by fabric. Intimacy was expected to remain private, invisible, unacknowledged. Gloves also reinforced class distinction. Clean, well-fitted gloves signaled leisure, access to laundering, freedom from manual labor. Worn or absent gloves suggested work, necessity, or neglect. A woman's hands told a story, and gloves allowed her to edit it carefully. Roughness was hidden. Marks were concealed. The body was presented as untouched by effort. There were strict rules governing glove etiquette. Gloves were removed for eating, but not hastily. They were never placed directly on a table. They were folded, held, managed discreetly. Fumbling with gloves suggested nervousness or inexperience. Mastery of these small rituals marked a woman as properly trained. Failure carried consequences. A woman without gloves in public might be mistaken for someone of lower class or questionable respectability. Even if innocent, the impression lingered. Appearances mattered more than explanation. Gloves were preventative, not corrective. The moral symbolism ran deep. Gloves suggested purity, restraint, and separation. They reinforced the idea that a woman's body should not be directly encountered by the world. Fabric stood between skin and society, mediating every interaction. This distance was framed as dignity. Over time, gloves shaped behavior itself. Gestures became smaller. Hands rested quietly. Touch was avoided altogether when possible. Women learned to communicate without reaching, to express without contact. The body receded further behind layers of etiquette. Even moments of vulnerability were managed through gloves. Illness, fatigue, emotional strain, all were masked behind proper appearance. To remove gloves in public distress would be to admit bodily reality, and bodily reality was something Victorian society preferred women keep hidden. In this way, gloves functioned as moral barriers as much as physical ones. They reminded women constantly of where their bodies ended and society's expectations began. They were worn not just to cover hands, but to enforce distance from others, from sensation, from self. Long after gloves loosened their grip on fashion, the lesson they taught remained. That touch should be cautious, that exposure invites judgment, that even the smallest barrier can carry enormous weight. In Victorian high society, a gloved hand was never empty. It carried restraint, status, and the quiet message that a woman's body was not meant to be fully known. To eat, in Victorian high society, was to reveal oneself. Appetite betrayed the body's needs, and needs were not considered elegant. For women especially, eating in public was a delicate negotiation between necessity and propriety, one misstep away from judgment. The table, like every other social space, was a stage, and hunger was an actor best kept out of sight. From an early age, girls were taught not simply how to eat, but how little to appear to want. Food was taken in small portions, lifted lightly, consumed quietly. Bites were measured. Chewing was discreet. Silence was prized. A woman who ate eagerly, who reached quickly for food, or who appeared genuinely hungry, risked being read as undisciplined. Appetite suggested excess, and excess suggested moral weakness. Victorian etiquette manuals devoted astonishing attention to the act of eating. How to hold utensils, where to rest the hands, when to raise a glass. Even swallowing was to be done invisibly. The ideal diner left no trace of effort behind. The meal should appear to pass through her without impact, as though the body required no sustenance at all. Public eating intensified this scrutiny. Tea rooms, social gatherings, formal dinners, each carried its own rules, but the underlying expectation remained the same. A woman was not to draw attention to the act of nourishment. Eating was permitted, but only within strict limits of decorum. Hunger was to be mastered, not acknowledged. Certain foods were considered particularly dangerous. Anything messy, aromatic, or difficult to manage posed risk. Sauces, large cuts of meat, foods requiring hands rather than utensils, all were avoided. Choosing such items suggested carelessness or boldness. A woman was expected to select foods that preserved her composure, even if they offered little satisfaction. The symbolism ran deeper than manners. Victorian culture equated restraint at the table with restraint in character. A woman who could deny herself food was assumed capable of denying herself other desires as well. Appetite, whether physical or emotional, was treated as something to suppress. Eating lightly became a moral performance. Illness complicated matters further. Women who were frail or faint were pitied, even admired. Thinness suggested delicacy, yet eating too little could provoke concern if it became visible. The balance was precise, enough to maintain appearance, never enough to suggest need. The body was expected to exist in a narrow range between hunger and collapse. There was also the matter of observation. Meals were social events, closely watched. Women monitored one another as carefully as they were monitored by men. A woman who ate too much might become the subject of whispers. A woman who ate too little might attract commentary of another kind. Either way, the table was not a place of ease. Domestic meals offered little reprieve. Even within the home, women were expected to maintain decorum. Servants observed, family members judged, mothers corrected daughters quietly. The lesson was constant. How you eat reflects who you are. Medical discourse again reinforced these norms. Women were described as having sensitive stomachs, fragile digestion, nervous systems easily disturbed by heavy food. Rather than questioning why so many women felt unwell, physicians prescribed lighter diets. Appetite was pathologized, not satisfied. Hunger became something to manage medically or morally, not addressed directly. Over time, many women internalized these expectations so thoroughly that they lost trust in their own hunger. They ate because it was time, not because they needed to. They learned to ignore bodily signals, to prioritize appearance over nourishment. The consequences, fatigue, dizziness, fainting, were treated as evidence of femininity rather than warning signs. In this way, eating became another act of restraint. A woman proved her worth not by sustaining herself, but by denying herself gracefully. The table was a test, and many failed it silently. To eat in public was dangerous not because food itself was improper, but because it exposed need. And in Victorian high society, a woman was expected to need nothing at all. In the parlors and drawing rooms of Victorian high society, appetite was never merely a bodily necessity, it was a moral statement. To feel hunger, to desire sustenance, was to risk being read as indulgent, greedy, or insufficiently disciplined. A woman's very need to eat became, in the eyes of her peers, a reflection of character. Appetite was a flaw, and flaws were never forgiven lightly. From early childhood, girls were taught that restraint was a virtue. Meals were orchestrated lessons in moderation, portions were measured, timing was dictated. Even expressions of pleasure, an exhaled sigh at a favored dish, a lingering glance at a sweet treat were censured. Appetite had to be hidden, denied, or disguised. A girl who reached eagerly for a second helping might be gently corrected, her behavior framed as a lapse in refinement, a breach of decorum that could mark her reputation for years to come. This careful management of hunger extended far beyond the table. It became a constant negotiation between physical need and social expectation. Women learned to suppress visible signs of hunger. No rumbling stomach, no impatient shifting, no longing glance at food that was just out of reach. Breathing was measured to avoid drawing attention. Gestures were tempered to avoid motion that might suggest desperation. The body itself had to be disciplined or risk exposure. Even subtle indulgences were fraught with danger. A bite of cake, a sip of wine, a taste of fruit, all carried significance. To enjoy such things openly was to flaunt appetite, to suggest desire. Desire, in turn, hinted at autonomy. A woman who allowed herself pleasure might be perceived as insufficiently controlled, morally suspect, or socially ambitious. Her body and its urges became a terrain of scrutiny, mapped by the eyes of others more carefully than by her own experience. The obsession with controlled appetite was reinforced by medical and moral discourse. Women were described as delicate, constitutionally weak, prone to overexcitement or hysteria. Appetite, then, was not merely ungentlemanly, it was dangerous. Overeating threatened nerves, digestion, and composure. Even undernourishment was preferred to excess, as it signaled virtue, endurance, and refinement. Physicians prescribed light diets and frequent restraint, blending care with social pressure to ensure women remained properly fragile. In social settings, this discipline was performed publicly. At balls, afternoon teas, and formal dinners, women moved with careful timing and minimal gestures. They sipped, tasted, nibbled, and paused, demonstrating mastery over both body and desire. To be seen eating too heartily, to swallow audibly, or to reach too quickly for a favored dish risked gossip, judgment, and diminished prospects. The act of consuming food became a silent negotiation of power, propriety, and self-control. The psychological effects were profound. Many women grew accustomed to ignoring their bodies entirely, substituting appearance for need. Fatigue, faintness, and chronic discomfort were endured without complaint, internalized as evidence of discipline rather than warning signs. Pleasure itself was muted. Hunger became a private struggle, fought quietly behind gloves and corsets, hidden smiles and polite conversation. Yet appetite's suppression was also a mark of triumph. To remain composed despite hunger was to signal refinement. To deny the body its desires was to assert moral fortitude. In a society obsessed with appearances, mastery over appetite became a proxy for mastery over life itself. One could control oneself, and therefore one could be trusted in the delicate, intricate web of social hierarchy. Thus, in the gaslit rooms and perfumed parlors of Victorian England, appetite was never neutral. It was a measure of character, a test of virtue, and a terrain where discipline and desire collided. To feel hunger was human. To display, it was dangerous. To master, it was to survive. In Victorian high society, dining was less an act of nourishment than a performance of moral, social, and aesthetic discipline. The table became a theatre in which every gesture, every posture, every movement of the body was scrutinized. To sit correctly, to eat correctly, to even lift a utensil correctly was to demonstrate refinement. To fail even slightly was to reveal imperfection in upbringing, character, and virtue. From early girlhood, young women were drilled in the ritualized patterns of dining. Chairs were approached with care, skirts arranged to fall without wrinkle, hands positioned with grace. Each movement was rehearsed repeatedly until it became instinctive. The body itself was trained to appear delicate, obedient, and untroubled by its own needs. There was no room for haste, hunger, or clumsiness. Even a glance at one's plate required discretion, lest it appear greedy or unrefined. Conversation at the table was equally regimented. Speech was to be minimal, polite, and responsive rather than initiatory. Interruptions were forbidden. Questions were measured, carefully phrased, to display knowledge without arrogance. Laughter and expression were muted, gestures controlled, and hands never allowed to wander freely. Eating was a silent choreography of restraint, each bite a test of composure. The rules governing utensils were particularly exacting. Forks, knives, spoons, each had its proper use, placement, and handling. To hold a knife incorrectly, to place a fork improperly, or to scrape the plate audibly was a sign of deficiency. Etiquette manuals outlined every scenario: soup, roast, fish, dessert. Every course demanded a new set of maneuvers. The act of dining became an endless sequence of choices, each with social consequences. Even accidental errors carried weight. Dropped cutlery, spilled liquid, smudged napkins. These were not merely mistakes, but indications of moral laxity. Other diners observed quietly, eyes noting hesitation, fumbling, or impatience. The consequences were subtle but lasting: whispered commentary, polite disapproval, the impression that a woman was inexperienced or untrained. Dining, once a simple human necessity, became a ritual of surveillance and discipline. This tyranny extended to physical posture. Backs were straight, shoulders poised, elbows tucked, hands rested lightly on the table, never pressing, never fidgeting. Leaning forward too eagerly suggested appetite. Reclining too deeply implied boredom or indolence. Even the act of lifting a glass required care. A tilt too abrupt, a sip too audible, and a woman risked being judged for her indulgence. Each motion was both practical and moral, marking obedience and refinement simultaneously. The environment itself reinforced these rules. Heavy draperies, polished silver, crystal glasses, and glimmering porcelain demanded careful navigation. Noise carried easily in the high-ceilinged rooms. A cough, a scrape, a clink could echo scandalously. Women learned to eat in almost complete silence, turning physical necessity into an exercise in vigilance. Medical advice of the era further justified this discipline. Women were said to have delicate nerves and fragile digestion. Excessive movement, haste, or indulgence could destabilize health. Moderation, control, and restraint were framed not only as moral imperatives, but as physical necessities. Compliance at the table was both socially and medically virtuous. Over time, the tyranny of table manners reshaped perception. Pleasure became muted, appetite contained, and bodily awareness subdued. The meal was experienced as performance rather than sustenance. Many women internalized the scrutiny so thoroughly that even in private, eating became a measured act. The body was trained to obey long after observers had departed. In this way, the Victorian dining table functioned as a microcosm of society itself, rigid, hierarchical, and governed by invisible rules. To dine properly was to survive socially, to fail was to invite judgment. Through endless repetition, young women learned that refinement was not a matter of thought, but of discipline. Discipline enacted through every gesture, bite, and glance at the table. In Victorian high society, even the faintest noise at the table was considered a breach of decorum. The clink of a fork against porcelain, the scrape of a knife across a plate, the tap of a spoon, each sound carried social significance, interpreted as evidence of carelessness, haste, or emotional indulgence. For women, the management of cutlery was more than manners, it was a test of refinement, self-control, and moral standing. From the earliest lessons, girls were trained to handle their utensils with painstaking precision. Forks were to be held lightly, knives angled delicately, spoons rested without clatter. The hand moved in controlled arcs, deliberate and smooth. To raise a piece of food to the mouth was to execute a miniaturized performance, one that could be judged by every observer at the table. Sound was to be minimized, gesture perfected. Noise betrayed the body's natural hunger and, by extension, the self's impulsive nature. Silence, in this context, was virtue. A well-bred woman did not announce her presence with sound. She did not scrape, tap, or strike. She ate as if the meal were secondary, an obligation to be fulfilled discreetly. Eating, like breathing, had to be moderated to the point of invisibility. Any audible indication of appetite risked undermining the carefully maintained image of composure and restraint. The pressure of this expectation extended to every course. Soup required the gentlest tilt of the spoon, as liquid sloshed audibly at even the slightest miscalculation. Meat demanded precise slicing, knives moving only as firmly as necessary, without rasp or scrape. Vegetables, pastry, delicate confections, each presented unique challenges. To mishandle them was not merely a mistake, it was a display of inadequacy, a subtle suggestion that the woman could not control her body or her impulses. Observant company reinforced these rules without overt comment. A clatter drew sharp, silent scrutiny. Eyes darted, eyebrows lifted. Even when unspoken, judgment fell. Other diners noted the infraction, filed it quietly, and allowed it to linger as a mark against character. A woman who consistently produced sound, however small, risked reputational damage that polite society would not immediately forgive. The regulation of cutlery also reinforced social hierarchy and gender norms. Men might be excused for minor missteps. women were expected to exhibit perfection. Mastery over utensils symbolized moral and intellectual discipline, signaling a readiness for marriage, social responsibility, and the delicate maintenance of appearances. To mishandle them was to reveal the body and, by implication, the mind as insufficiently refined. Medical and moral commentary of the era intertwined with these expectations. Women were described as nervous, delicate, or constitutionally prone to excess. Excess of sound, motion, or appetite could strain nerves and disrupt the body. Etiquette thus served both as moral guidance and physical management. The cutlery was as much a tool for self-control as a utensil for consumption. Over time, women internalized these pressures. Many developed an almost imperceptible style of eating. Hands moved with measured intent, wrists rigid, elbows tucked, mouths quiet. Pleasure, appetite, and natural motion were subdued, folded neatly into the discipline required to survive socially. Sound became a luxury few could afford. Thus, the simple act of handling cutlery became a profound exercise in self-discipline. To dine properly was to demonstrate mastery over body, emotion, and desire. The absence of noise conveyed calm, refinement, and virtue. The slightest clatter betrayed imperfection. In the gas-lit parlors and candle-lit dining rooms of Victorian society, the improper sound of cutlery was more than an infraction. It was evidence that a woman's self-control, carefully taught and meticulously maintained, might be slipping. In the parlors and drawing rooms of Victorian high society, the simple act of sitting carried the weight of propriety, morality, and perception. A chair was no longer merely a piece of furniture. It was a stage upon which every curve, posture, and movement was scrutinized. To occupy a seat improperly was to betray upbringing, to suggest sloth or carelessness, and to invite the subtle judgments of observers who required constant proof of refinement. From childhood, girls were trained in the rigid choreography of sitting, knees together, back straight, shoulders restrained. Hands were to rest lightly in the lap or delicately upon armrests, never fidgeting, never draping casually. Crossing legs at the knee was permitted only in the strictest circumstances, and even then with subtle restraint. Movement was minimal. Every gesture was measured to appear natural while suppressing bodily impulse. Comfort was not the goal. Appearance was. The furniture itself demanded compliance. High-backed chairs required upright posture. Low, deep-seated sofas encouraged temptation, a laxity of form that was socially unacceptable. A chair was chosen not merely for convenience, but for the ease with which it could enforce restraint. Seating arrangements at gatherings were designed to reinforce hierarchy, ensure visibility, and maintain control over the body. To sit improperly was to signal inattention to social rules, or worse, defiance. The act of sitting was also a rehearsal in patience. Women were taught to glide into a chair with grace, to settle without shifting unnecessarily, to remain poised for extended periods. Even the slightest adjustment was executed with caution. A brush of the skirt, a turn of the torso, a repositioning of hands, all performed quietly, imperceptibly, lest attention be drawn. To shift too frequently suggested discomfort, desire for freedom, or emotional volatility, signals to be carefully avoided. Meals, meetings, and calls all demanded mastery of posture. Leaning forward was permissible only when expressing attentiveness. Leaning back could be interpreted as arrogance or boredom. Crossing the ankles was a subtle expression of decorum, while overextension or sprawling movement suggested sloppiness. Eyes were lowered, hands controlled, expressions neutral. Every seated moment was an exercise in restraint, a physical translation of the moral and social code that governed all female behavior. Even in private, the rules of sitting were reinforced. Mothers, governesses, and older sisters corrected lapses quietly but insistently. "Sit properly," they would say. a phrase that encompassed both body and character. Over time, girls internalized these instructions to such a degree that posture became instinctive, a default expression of discipline rather than a conscious choice. To sit incorrectly was to feel exposed, even when alone. Medical discourse of the era further justified this rigor. A proper posture was said to preserve health, aid digestion, and support fragile nerves. Slouching was interpreted as both physical weakness and moral deficiency. Comfort was secondary. Virtue required discipline. A woman who endured minor discomfort without complaint was praised, her suffering interpreted as refinement rather than bodily necessity. The consequences of misalignment were social as well as moral. Guests, observers, and peers would note a slouched back, splayed knees, or wandering hands. Gossip might circulate quietly, reputations could be diminished, and opportunities for marriage or social advancement jeopardized. Mastery of posture was thus inseparable from survival within the rigid hierarchy of Victorian life. Ultimately, sitting correctly, or at least appearing to, taught women to inhabit their bodies with careful calculation. Movement, space, and weight were constantly monitored. Even in rest, the body was a tool of presentation. To fail was to expose oneself, not only physically, but socially and morally. In Victorian society, to sit improperly was to risk everything, and so women learned early that if one cannot sit correctly, it is better, perhaps, not to sit at all. In the drawing rooms, salons, and parlors of Victorian high society, a chair was far more than an object of comfort. It was a crucible, a silent arbiter of propriety, and a subtle test of character. To sit, or to approach a seat, was to reveal oneself, for posture, poise, and the handling of one's own body was scrutinized as carefully as speech, attire, and behavior. The chair, humble in appearance, carried the weight of society's expectations. From a girl's earliest lessons, the proper approach to a chair was drilled. Step lightly, never rush. Align your skirts so that they flow without wrinkle. Let the hem fall gracefully, without gathering beneath the body. Hands must be folded, palms resting lightly upon the lap or held delicately upon the armrests. Elbows were never permitted to jut outward. Shoulders must remain composed. Each movement was both instruction and rehearsal, a rehearsal that silently proclaimed the young woman's discipline. Sitting itself demanded exactitude. Backs must be straight, yet shoulders relaxed, knees pressed together, ankles crossed or parallel, depending upon the social code of the event. Shifts in position were allowed only when subtle and necessary, executed in silence. The act of reclining suggested affectation. Leaning too far forward indicated eagerness or impatience. Even the direction of one's gaze was significant. Eyes lowered to avoid appearing bold, yet attentive enough to indicate engagement. Every minute adjustment became a declaration of character. This control extended beyond mere posture. It governed perception. The ability to inhabit a chair gracefully signaled refinement, calm, and restraint. Sloppiness, imbalance, or awkward movement hinted at improper upbringing, lack of discipline, or emotional volatility. The chair revealed, more than manners, it revealed the body's obedience, the mind's self-control, and the character's alignment with societal expectations. In Victorian society, a well-handled chair reflected a well-handled life. Even minor missteps carried consequence. A fidget, a shift of weight, a dropped glove, all were quietly noted. Gossip, subtle as it was, could attach a single moment of inattention to an enduring narrative about character. The careful orchestration of the body became not merely an aesthetic exercise, but a means of social survival. To fail the test of the chair was to invite observation, speculation, and silent judgment. Medical and moral discourse reinforced this strict standard. Women were portrayed as constitutionally delicate, prone to nervousness and physical weakness. Posture, it was said, preserved health, strengthened the body, and ensured moral fortitude. A slouched back, a crooked leg, or a relaxed hand implied laxity not only in body but in spirit. Virtue, society claimed, manifested physically, and the chair was one of its stages. The chair also enforced hierarchy and ritual. Seating arrangements were deliberate. The most esteemed, the guests of honor, and the socially adept occupied positions of prominence. The correct handling of a chair communicated recognition of these arrangements, signaling awareness, discretion, and humility. A misstep approaching a seat too quickly, claiming the wrong position, or sitting with carelessness could upset social balance, even if no overt offense was intended. Over time, women internalized this lesson. Sitting became second nature, a choreography performed with minimal conscious thought. Grace emerged from repetition, fear, and necessity. The chair taught them to navigate physical presence, anticipate scrutiny, and align self with expectation. It was not merely a seat, it was a mirror, reflecting restraint, refinement, and adherence to the invisible codes that structured every moment of a woman's life. In Victorian society, the chair tested more than comfort, it tested composure, control, and character. To sit well was to exist properly. To fail was to reveal the body, the mind, and the self as insufficiently disciplined. And so, for generations, women learned that even in stillness, every gesture mattered, and the chair itself became a subtle, unyielding measure of worth. In Victorian high society, words were never free. For women, speech was not a spontaneous act, but a controlled performance, measured in both quantity and quality, gauged for propriety, delicacy, and social safety. The moment a girl learned to speak, she also learned that the space her words occupied, like the space her body inhabited, was limited. Speech was measured in inches, and even the smallest overstep could invite censure. From childhood, girls were trained to temper not only the content of their words, but their volume, tone, and timing. Interruptions were strictly forbidden. Speaking too quickly suggested eagerness or impetuosity. Speaking too slowly implied hesitance or weakness. Even in casual conversation, girls were instructed to pause, to consider, and to restrain enthusiasm. Each word had weight, each syllable was observed. One misplaced utterance could betray education, upbringing, or moral standing. The lessons extended to social gatherings, where the stakes were higher. At a tea, a ball, or a drawing room visit, women were expected to speak only when spoken to. Questions were to be phrased carefully, avoiding direct challenge. Opinions were allowed sparingly, framed to convey intelligence without ambition. Humor was permitted, but laughter must be subdued, a gentle ripple rather than an eruption. Excessiveness, even of wit or insight, could be perceived as arrogance, forwardness, or immodesty. In these regulated moments, speech became more than communication. It became armor. Women learned to phrase, qualify, and soften their thoughts, often rehearsing internally before uttering a single word. Hesitation was prized as evidence of deliberation, precision as evidence of training. To speak freely, spontaneously, or boldly was to risk exposure. The smallest deviation could spark whispers, doubt, or quiet condemnation. The physical self was implicated in this discipline. Breath, posture, and gesture accompanied speech. Shallow breathing, moderated tone. Hands remained still, or moved lightly to punctuate without dominance. Eyes were lowered unless polite acknowledgement required glance. Each element combined to present a controlled, measured presence, one that reinforced the measured nature of the words themselves. A woman's speech and her body were inseparable in their performance of decorum. Medical and moral advice reinforced the limitations on female speech. Women were described as nervous or delicate, prone to excitement, hysteria, or imbalance. Excessive talking was said to strain the nerves, disturb digestion, or compromise health. Etiquette, therefore, was both a social and physiological imperative. Silence and measured expression were framed as virtuous, protective, and necessary for the preservation of mind and body alike. The consequences of misjudged speech were tangible. A woman who spoke out of turn might be labeled impertinent or ill-bred. An unsolicited opinion could undermine her reputation for modesty. A word spoken too loudly, too boldly, or too often could be remembered long after it was uttered, a permanent mark against propriety. Conversational restraint became survival, and mastery over silence a quiet triumph. Over time, women internalized these rules, often censoring themselves even in private. Spontaneous speech became rare. Thought was measured before articulation. Words were chosen not only for meaning, but for subtlety, acceptability, and discretion. The act of speaking, once natural, became a calculated negotiation of risk and image. Thus, in Victorian high society, speech was a tightrope. Every sentence was measured in inches, carefully extended, precisely positioned, delicately balanced. To speak correctly was to demonstrate virtue, composure, and refinement. To speak carelessly was to expose oneself, physically and socially. And in this way, words became both a tool and a restraint, binding women to the invisible codes of decorum that governed every facet of their existence. In the parlors and drawing rooms of Victorian high society, opinions were dangerous territory for a woman. Thought itself, when expressed too directly, was considered unseemly. A well-bred lady was expected to observe, reflect, and respond with gentleness, but never to assert her own convictions. To have an opinion was to risk appearing bold, forward, or morally presumptuous. In this society, knowledge and insight were prized only when delivered with restraint, humility, and invisibility. From early girlhood, lessons in opinion began subtly. Girls were encouraged to agree with elders, to echo approved viewpoints, and to defer judgment. Questioning was permissible only within narrow, socially sanctioned boundaries. Even curiosity and instinctive desire to understand the world was reframed as something to be tamed, moderated, and expressed only when socially safe. Thought was internalized long before it could be articulated. By adolescence, these lessons were enforced more rigidly. Young women learned that expressing an opinion could shift perception in an instant. Speaking too boldly implied arrogance. Offering a dissenting view suggested impertinence. Even expressing a preference about clothing, literature, or social arrangements risked gossip and subtle criticism. The safe course was acquiescence, to nod, smile, and echo others' views. Conformity was valued above authenticity. Opinions were further constrained by gendered expectations. Men were encouraged to debate, to assert, and to persuade. Their speech carried authority and weight. Women, by contrast, were measured not only by what they said, but by whether their speech conformed to social norms of submission and decorum. To express disagreement or personal insight was to threaten hierarchy, to assert agency, and, in the eyes of many, to step beyond the bounds of femininity. Even in intellectual or domestic settings, the suppression of opinion was reinforced. Discussions of literature, philosophy, or current events were permitted only when guided by male authority or mediated by social expectation. Women's observations were acceptable if offered indirectly, through deference, or framed as curiosity rather than conviction. Assertion was considered unladylike. Boldness, unseemly. Thought was safe only when cloaked in humility. This expectation extended to every interaction, formal or casual. Social visits, calls, and assemblies demanded careful monitoring of speech. A comment made too strongly, a question asked too directly, could draw invisible censure. A woman's reputation depended not on her intelligence, but on her ability to restrain it to ensure that the display of knowledge or judgment never overstepped invisible boundaries. Medical and moral discourse reinforced these norms. Women were described as emotionally delicate, intellectually pliable, and constitutionally nervous. Independence of thought was portrayed as destabilizing, a potential threat to health and propriety. Compliance and acquiescence were framed as protective, preserving both social harmony and the woman's delicate constitution. To assert opinion was not merely social risk, it was moral and physical impropriety. Over time, women internalized these lessons. Many learned to doubt their own thoughts, to censor instinctive judgment, and to value silence over expression. Authenticity was sacrificed to survival. Curiosity became cautious reflection. Even private musings were filtered through social expectation, shaping the mind as strictly as manners shaped the body. Thus, in Victorian society, opinions were unladylike not because thought itself was wrong, but because its expression threatened the carefully maintained hierarchy of decorum. To think boldly was dangerous. To speak boldly, nearly forbidden. In the delicate architecture of etiquette, a woman's intellect was to be hidden, restrained, and rendered almost invisible, a silent, controlled presence, ever compliant with the rules that governed her existence. In Victorian high society, the hierarchy of speech was as carefully policed as posture, movement, and gesture. Women were expected to speak, but never to contradict. To challenge a man's assertion even gently, even with reason, was considered brazen, impertinent, and socially dangerous. From childhood, girls were taught that obedience in conversation was not mere courtesy. It was survival. The act of contradiction carried consequences that extended beyond the moment, quietly shaping reputation and opportunity. Lessons began early. In the family home, girls observed their fathers, brothers, and uncles speak with authority, their statements rarely questioned. Mothers modeled compliance, reminding daughters to agree politely, even when privately dissenting. A correction or disagreement, delivered too openly, could provoke disapproval or scolding. Girls learned that words must be weighed, tempered, and measured to avoid overstepping invisible boundaries. This principle extended into society at large. Drawing rooms, salons, and social gatherings required constant vigilance. A woman might be asked a question about literature, politics, or current events, but the acceptable response was never an outright contradiction. To disagree was to risk offense, scandal, or whispering gossip. Even carefully phrased dissent was scrutinized. The rules were precise yet unwritten: defer, qualify, smile, and acquiesce. Assertiveness was dangerous. The restriction reinforced broader social hierarchies. Men, by virtue of gender, were expected to speak with authority. Their words were taken seriously, their knowledge presumed accurate. Women's speech, conversely, was provisional, judged for tone, timing, and effect. To contradict was to challenge the social order itself, an implicit act of rebellion disguised as opinion. This dynamic trained women to internalize moderation, preferring silence or cautious agreement over expression. Physical demeanor accompanied verbal restraint. A lifted eyebrow, a pursed lip, or a subtle shake of the head could be interpreted as defiance, even when the words themselves were compliant. Women learned to monitor not only what they said, but how they said it. Every glance, gesture, and breath was filtered through a lens of propriety, ensuring that even subtle indications of disagreement were muted or redirected. Medical and moral discourse of the era reinforced these limitations. Women were described as delicate, emotional, and constitutionally nervous, ill-suited to confrontational or assertive behavior. Contradiction was framed not merely as social impropriety, but as a potential threat to health and composure. Obedience and submission were not only morally correct but physiologically appropriate. Silence, moderation, and agreement were prescribed as virtues that preserved both body and social standing. The consequences of misjudged contradiction were subtle but lasting. A single spoken disagreement could result in exclusion from social circles, whispered censure, or diminished marital prospects. A woman's intellectual or moral credibility could be questioned, and she might find herself constrained not only in conversation, but in movement, attention, and influence. Reputations were fragile, and the perception of temperance was as valuable as actual knowledge. Over time, women internalized this restraint, shaping thought as much as speech. Ideas were filtered through anticipation. What could be said safely, what should remain silent, what could be expressed indirectly. Many became skilled in implication, suggestion, and nuance, mastering the art of communicating without confrontation. Silence became a protective measure, not merely a social expectation. Thus, in the gaslit salons and candlelit drawing rooms of Victorian England, contradiction was forbidden. To question, challenge, or oppose a man was not only audacious, it was dangerous. Women learned early that agreement, careful phrasing, and measured compliance were essential to survival. Speech, like posture and movement, became a domain of control. In the intricate architecture of etiquette, to contradict a man was to risk everything. And so, most women learned to speak softly, defer wisely, and restrain their thoughts even as they carried them within. In Victorian high society, the face was never neutral, the body never wholly private. Every expression, every twitch of muscle or glimmer of the eye was scrutinized, measured against invisible rules of propriety. Among the most demanding of these rules was the expectation of emotional restraint. A woman's feelings, joy, sorrow, anger, excitement were not hers to display freely. To allow emotion to surface too visibly was to risk judgment, gossip, and social censure. Elegance was measured not in wealth or accomplishment alone, but in the mastery of the self. From early girlhood, this lesson was instilled. Mothers and governesses trained girls to temper reactions, to modulate laughter, to soften sighs. Tears were permitted only under carefully controlled circumstances. Anger or irritation was never tolerated in public. Even delight had to be contained, a quiet ripple rather than an eruption. Every feeling was filtered through the lens of decorum, every expression curated before it could reach the observer. The cultivation of restraint extended to every facet of life. At home, girls practiced composure during play, meals, and lessons, learning to conceal frustration, impatience, or desire. In public, the stakes were higher. Social gatherings required careful observation, not only of others, but of one's own responses. To gasp at news, to blush at attention, or to frown in thoughtlessness could undo years of careful preparation. Emotional restraint was an armor, shielding reputation even as it constrained authenticity. Medical and moral writings reinforced the necessity of this discipline. Women were described as constitutionally delicate, their nervous systems easily overstimulated by strong emotion. Excessive laughter, grief, or anger was said to threaten both health and moral character. Calmness, moderation, and poise were not merely socially desirable, they were deemed essential to well-being. Women were taught to interpret their own feelings with caution, to monitor physical responses to emotion, and to suppress impulses that might appear in public. The consequences of failing were subtle but profound. A woman who cried too openly was labeled hysterical or overly sensitive. One who smiled too readily was forward or frivolous. Anger, if visible, was scandalous. Even justified indignation could damage social standing. Observers interpreted emotional expression as evidence of character. The absence of it suggested refinement. In this way, control over feeling became inseparable from social survival. The internalization of restraint had deep effects on thought and experience. Women learned to compartmentalize, to experience joy, grief, and desire inwardly, while presenting calm, even serenity, outwardly. Emotional energy was muted, repressed, or redirected into approved channels: art, music, charity, or quiet conversation. Pleasure became private, sorrow discreet, frustration internalized. Authenticity was sacrificed to social survival, yet this sacrifice was praised as virtue. Even minor gestures were monitored. A trembling hand, a quickened breath, a faint flush, all could betray feeling. Women trained themselves to steady their hands, control their posture, and modulate their voice. The body became a constant instrument of restraint, as essential as the mind's careful censorship. To appear composed was to be admired. To falter, even slightly, was to risk exposure. In drawing rooms, promenades, and social gatherings, emotional restraint became a defining mark of femininity. Women were admired not for visible feeling, but for their ability to conceal it with grace. Elegance, therefore, was inseparable from control. The less the world saw, the more virtuous the woman appeared. And so, in Victorian society, feelings were managed as carefully as dress, posture, or speech. To laugh too freely, to blush too brightly, to show sorrow or anger openly was dangerous. Emotional restraint became a form of armor, a silent language of refinement, and a necessary condition for survival. Elegance was the mastery of the self, the quiet assertion that even the most human of experiences could be kept perfectly in check. In the hushed parlors and candlelit drawing rooms of Victorian high society, tears were permitted, but only within carefully defined bounds. To cry openly, with abandon, was to signal disorder, weakness, or moral lapse. A well-bred woman could weep, yes, but her sorrow had to be contained, measured, and barely audible, lest the display betray more than grief. Tears, like all other expressions of emotion, were a performance as much as they were a release. From early childhood, girls were taught the subtle art of regulated emotion. Mothers and governesses demonstrated the acceptable manner of shedding tears. A faint glisten in the eye, a single handkerchief held delicately to the corner of the cheek, a soft, suppressed breath rather than a heaving sob. Noise was forbidden. Movement had to be minimal. Any hint of exaggeration, quivering shoulders, shaking hands, or audible sighs risked censure. The lesson was clear. Sorrow is permitted, but only as long as it does not disturb the order of the room. Public displays were even more tightly controlled. At funerals, at evening gatherings, at moments of misfortune, women were expected to perform grief in miniature. Eyes lowered, lips pressed together, body composed. Tears could be acknowledged, but they must not dominate the space. The social function of mourning was as important as the emotion itself. A woman who wept too freely could overshadow others, disrupt the delicate balance of propriety, and attract whispered judgment. The paradox of acceptable tears was striking. They were a sign of sensibility, a mark of refinement, yet they also carried risk. Too few, and a woman might be seen as cold, unfeeling, or insensitive. Too many, and she became excessive, frivolous, or morally suspect. Mastery lay in precision, enough to signal feeling, never so much as to reveal the body's vulnerability or the mind's unrest. Even in private, many women learned to gauge the intensity of their sorrow against an internalized standard of decorum. The restriction of tears was intertwined with the broader expectation of emotional restraint. Women were encouraged to internalize their feelings, to experience grief quietly, and to maintain composure regardless of inner turbulence. The body was trained to betray nothing, even as the heart was permitted to ache. Hands were steady, breath shallow, movements subtle. The spectacle of vulnerability was carefully rehearsed, reduced to a faint shimmer of liquid at the eye, a whisper of air through the nostrils. Medical and moral authorities lent weight to these lessons. Women were described as constitutionally delicate, prone to emotional excess, and in need of regulation. Excessive crying could be read as evidence of ill health, nervous strain, or moral instability. Moderation, therefore, was not only socially prudent, but physiologically advised. Tears were to be managed, restrained, and performed with precision. Even in private correspondence, the lessons persisted. Letters expressing sorrow were measured in tone and length. Overly dramatic descriptions were discouraged. Understatement was praised as virtuous. Personal grief was reshaped into controlled narrative, a mirror of the public performance women were expected to maintain. The mind itself learned self-regulation alongside the body. Ultimately, the allowance of tears was a subtle assertion of control. Women learned that emotion could exist, but must never dominate. It could be visible, but only in small, socially acceptable doses. To cry quietly was not weakness, but skill. Elegance was preserved even in grief. To fail, to weep too loudly, too long, too visibly, was to reveal vulnerability that Victorian society sought to conceal. And the consequences, judgment, rumour, diminished standing could linger far beyond the fleeting moment of display. In this way, tears became more than signs of feeling. They became a demonstration of mastery, a test of refinement, and an intricate exercise in surviving within the invisible yet omnipresent rules of propriety. In the gaslit rooms of Victorian England, to cry quietly was to remain proper, even while sorrow touched the soul. In the subdued, perfumed parlors of Victorian high society, anger was the most perilous of emotions a woman could display. Where tears could be allowed if restrained, laughter tolerated if muted, anger was never condoned. It threatened the delicate equilibrium of etiquette, challenged the carefully constructed hierarchy, and marked a woman as morally and socially volatile. To feel indignation was natural, to show it was dangerous. From earliest girlhood, lessons in temper were relentless. Mothers, governesses, and older sisters modeled restraint, showing how to bite back retorts, soften criticism, and swallow indignation. Girls were trained to anticipate frustration and diffuse it silently, through posture, glance, or polite words. Expression of anger was reframed as vulgar, unseemly, and unladylike. The slightest flare, a sharp tone, a raised eyebrow, a quivering lip risked censure. Anger in public, however slight, carried consequences far beyond the moment. A raised voice at a social gathering could become fodder for gossip. A sharp reply to a question, however justified, was remembered, whispered about, and cited as evidence of poor upbringing or deficient character. The appearance of composure mattered more than the cause of the emotion. Perception outweighed reality. In this way, a woman's social survival depended on mastery not only of body and gesture, but of feeling itself. Even in private settings, the suppression of anger was drilled into habit. Domestic interactions demanded careful modulation of tone and expression. Complaints, grievances, and criticisms were to be softened, delayed, or expressed indirectly. Displeasure became coded: a sigh, a turn of the head, a carefully measured pause. Direct confrontation was avoided, replaced with subtle signals intelligible only to those trained to read them. Emotional subtlety became a form of social literacy. Medical and moral discourses reinforced these restrictions. Women were described as constitutionally delicate, their nerves easily strained by agitation or excitement. Anger was said to endanger health, provoke hysteria, and disrupt moral equilibrium. Social and physiological imperatives converged. Emotional control was both a civic and bodily duty. To appear unruly was to threaten both one's reputation and one's constitution. The paradox of this rule was severe. While men were encouraged, even admired, for displays of controlled indignation, or decisive force, women's anger was pathologized. A man could assert himself, confront, or dominate. A woman who attempted the same was branded improper, immodest, or untrustworthy. Hierarchy and gender intersected in every glance, every gesture, and every word, ensuring that women's agency remained circumscribed. Even minor irritations required training in suppression. A jostle in a crowded room, a misdelivered remark, an unwelcome observation, all were to be endured silently. Facial expression, tone of voice, and posture were adjusted to neutralize internal tumult. The body itself became a tool of concealment. Shoulders relaxed, lips neutral, eyes softened, hands still. Anger existed only as a private sensation, never to escape into audible or visible expression. Over time, this discipline became habitual, internalized so thoroughly that women often doubted their own instincts. Spontaneous indignation was filtered through years of anticipation. What was safe to express, what could remain private, and what would jeopardize reputation. Even legitimate resentment was suppressed, reshaped into subtle negotiation, coded speech, or quiet endurance. In Victorian society, anger was not merely improper, it was a threat. It exposed the body, challenged authority, and hinted at independence of thought, a dangerous combination. To be composed in the face of provocation was not only elegance, it was survival. In this world, mastery over emotion was inseparable from moral and social standing. Anger, if allowed to surface, could undo years of careful cultivation in an instant, leaving a woman exposed, judged, and vulnerable. And so, in the gaslit rooms of Victorian England, women learned to swallow indignation, soften the bite of discontent, and present serenity, even when their hearts burned. Emotional restraint was the highest refinement. Anger, even justified, was an unforgivable transgression. In Victorian high society, the written word was as powerful as speech, and perhaps more dangerous for women. A letter, so simple in its form, could undo reputation, expose desire, or betray judgment with terrifying permanence. Young women were trained early to treat pen and paper with the same vigilance as their bodies, posture, and expressions, for ink preserved transgression long after it had been committed. To write was to perform, and to perform incorrectly was to risk social annihilation. Education in letter writing began with careful instruction in tone, phrasing, and content. Girls learned that casual familiarity could be dangerous. Intimacy suggested impropriety. Every greeting, every closing, every adjective carried significance. Words had to be polished, measured, and neutral, even when conveying warmth. Enthusiasm could be misread as forwardness. Candor could imply disrespect. The pen became an extension of the self, a body controlled on paper, where mistakes were far less easily concealed. Letters were rarely private. Servants might handle delivery. Envelopes were observed. Correspondence could be intercepted, examined, or discussed. Women learned that nothing was truly secret, that even an innocent note could be misinterpreted. A single phrase, an over-familiar compliment, a casual mention of feelings, a jest too pointed, could spark gossip, suspicion, or censure. Reputation was fragile, and letters permanent. The stakes were higher than in spoken conversation, where tone, gesture, and inflection could mediate meaning. The page was silent and unyielding. The risk was particularly acute in matters of romance. Courtship relied heavily on written correspondence, yet letters were scrutinized for propriety as fiercely as any public gesture. A woman's expression of interest had to be subtle, coded, and deferential. A single overt declaration of emotion could invite ridicule or worse. The rules of restraint applied as strictly to the written word as to posture, breathing, or smile. In some cases, Even the timing of a reply carried moral weight. Too prompt suggested eagerness. Too delayed implied coldness or caprice. Family oversight was constant. Mothers, governesses, and elder sisters often supervised letter writing, reading drafts, suggesting edits, and censoring phrases that might be construed as forward. This supervision reinforced the lesson that a woman's voice could never be fully her own. It had to be mediated through the lenses of propriety, reputation, and survival. A letter that misstepped was not merely an error of taste, it was evidence of character, upbringing, and judgment. Letters also carried social consequences beyond romance. Invitations, thank yous, condolences, and formal communications required equal care. A miswritten line could offend a host, create rivalry, or mark a woman as ignorant of decorum. Even the choice of stationery, ink, or penmanship conveyed status, refinement, and adherence to social hierarchy. The act of writing was never casual. It was surveillance, discipline, and performance in one. Medical and moral authorities framed letter writing as a test of composure. Women were described as excitable or impressionable. A careless word could inflame nerves, cause anxiety, or provoke scandal. Control over written expression, therefore, was not merely decorous, it was a moral duty, a demonstration of discipline and intelligence. Over time, young women internalized these constraints. Letters were composed slowly, deliberately, and often rewritten multiple times. Expression became cautious, measured, and coded, as if the page were another drawing room where every movement was observed. The act of correspondence, like every other social interaction, was governed by invisible rules that weighed desire, propriety, and survival equally. In Victorian society, letters could be weapons, traps, or shields. A single phrase could ruin a life, a misstep could alter opportunity, and yet the disciplined letter could preserve dignity, demonstrate refinement, and protect reputation. Women learned that words, like gestures and glances, were never neutral, and that mastery over the pen was as essential as mastery over the body itself. In the delicate lattice of Victorian high society, timing was as crucial as content. A letter or message, received with haste or answered without reflection, could spark suspicion, gossip, or quiet condemnation. Women were taught that their responses, whether verbal, written, or gestural, must be measured, deliberate, and socially calculated. To reply too quickly was to betray eagerness, to display desire, or to reveal impatience, all of which were considered markers of improper character. From girlhood, the lesson of measured response was instilled subtly. When questions were posed, replies were expected to be thoughtful and restrained. A rushed answer suggested impulsivity or lack of decorum, a hint that the speaker had not mastered self-control. Mothers and governesses reminded girls that silence was a tool, a buffer, a way to gauge the social terrain before committing a word. Anticipation and hesitation were virtues. Immediacy was dangerous. In correspondence, this rule was even more exacting. Letters were not to be answered the instant they were received. Even a reply of gratitude or acknowledgement required deliberation. Too rapid a response could suggest desire or emotional dependence, particularly in courtship. To answer quickly was to risk revealing longing, eagerness, or lack of control qualities that Victorian society viewed as dangerous in women. Instead, replies were to be delayed just long enough to appear dignified, measured, and reflective, without tipping into neglect. The timing of responses extended beyond letters. In conversation, women were expected to pause before speaking, to weigh words, and to consider their social implications. Quick rejoinders, interjections, or affirmations were signs of impetuosity, a failure to conform to the rigid standards of refinement. Even laughter or agreement, if too immediate, could be read as forwardness or insufficient judgment. Social life became a continuous exercise in measured timing, where the most subtle hesitation conveyed virtue. This vigilance was reinforced by observation. Peers, elders, and suitors watched for signs of impatience or eagerness. A prompt reply might seem polite to the sender, but to the wider audience, it implied emotional availability, vulnerability, or a desire to please. Reputation depended on control, and speed betrayed it. Women quickly learned that in matters of communication, as in movement or gesture, the smallest infraction could ripple outward, shaping perception and opportunity. The rule also intersected with gendered power dynamics. Men were permitted, even expected, to reply quickly and decisively. Their words carried authority and decisiveness. Their promptness reflected command and confidence. Women, however, were measured against a higher standard. Patience was prized over impulsivity, caution over spontaneity. To respond immediately was to risk being read as socially ambitious, emotionally unsteady, or morally imprudent. Medical and moral authorities lent further weight to this discipline. Women were described as delicate and impressionable. Restraint in speech and correspondence was said to protect both nerves and social standing. Hesitation was framed as both prudent and healthful, reinforcing the expectation that patience and composure were intrinsic virtues. Over time, women internalized this lesson so thoroughly that their instincts were disciplined. Replies were composed with care, often rehearsed silently before utterance or penned with multiple drafts. Emotional impulse was subordinated to social expectation. Even private thought became tempered, as women anticipated the potential judgment that rapid speech or writing might invite. In Victorian society, to reply too quickly was to risk scandal, suspicion, and subtle social penalty. Timing, like posture, gesture, and expression, became a form of discipline, a method of negotiating presence, controlling perception, and preserving virtue. In this world, measured response was not merely etiquette, it was survival, and the failure to observe it could unravel years of careful cultivation in a single instant. In the labyrinthine social order of Victorian high society, the calling card was far more than a mere slip of paper. It was a tool, a symbol, and a form of quiet surveillance. For women, both sending and receiving cards required mastery. For each movement, each placement, and each timing was laden with meaning. A card was never neutral. It conveyed status, intention, and morality in a silent language understood by all, yet explained to none. From early lessons, young women were instructed in the precise art of the calling card. The card itself had rules. Its color, quality, and script reflected breeding and refinement. The envelope, or lack thereof, signaled familiarity or distance. How it was held, how it was offered, and even how long it remained in hand were all part of the performance. Every detail conveyed information about upbringing, discernment, and propriety. Presentation was ritualized. Cards were delivered with fingers held lightly at the corners, neither pinched tightly nor laid carelessly upon a silver tray. The card could be presented in silence or accompanied by a polite phrase, each choice dictated by context, relationship, and social hierarchy. Even the timing of the presentation carried significance. Too early suggested over-eagerness. Too late risked appearing indifferent or neglectful. Receiving cards was equally exacting. The moment a card arrived, a woman's response, or lack thereof, was interpreted. Immediate acceptance signaled attentiveness, yet prolonged examination hinted at deliberation or judgment. Placement upon the card tray was never casual. Cards had prescribed positions according to the social hierarchy of the sender. A misplacement was more than a mistake. It was an unintended social commentary. The ritual extended beyond the home. Cards were sent and received to announce visits, express gratitude, offer condolences, or signal interest. Each occasion carried rules, and deviation could provoke speculation. A woman who failed to leave a card promptly risked gossip. One who left too many, or at inappropriate times, appeared socially ambitious or indiscreet. In the eyes of society, the calling card was both weapon and shield, capable of elevating or undermining reputation with a single gesture. Observation reinforced this silent code. Guests noted who arrived, whose card had been left, and who had been omitted. In these small rituals, women judged one another, assessed alliances, and measured propriety. The calling card became a tool of both compliance and surveillance, allowing social hierarchies to be reinforced without overt confrontation. Subtlety was essential. The absence of action could speak as loudly as deliberate gestures. Medical and moral discourses lent weight to these practices. Women were described as delicate, sensitive to social judgment, and prone to overexertion of nerves. Mastery of these rituals, silent, precise, and deliberate, was framed as evidence of moral fortitude, composure, and refinement. Discipline in this small act mirrored discipline in character, teaching young women to navigate social space with control and vigilance. Over time, women internalized the rules of the calling card so thoroughly that even the smallest gesture became instinctive. Fingers rested lightly on paper, posture remained composed, and expressions were carefully managed. The social machinery ran smoothly because women had learned to anticipate judgment, to moderate behavior, and to speak volumes through silence. Thus, in Victorian society, the calling card was more than communication. It was a mirror of social morality, a measure of refinement, and a test of character. To navigate this ritual successfully required attentiveness, discipline, and subtlety. Misstep or even perceived indifference could ripple across reputation, subtly undermining years of cultivated virtue. In this world, the silent judgment of the calling card spoke louder than words, and women learned to obey it as they obeyed every other invisible law of propriety. In Victorian high society, eagerness was the most perilous of appearances for a woman. To display anticipation, to move with enthusiasm, or to show visible desire was to risk being interpreted as forward, frivolous, or morally lax. Every action, every gesture, every glance could betray intention. The cultivated air of restraint, the careful modulation of expression, and the deliberate pacing of movement were essential to survival. To appear eager was to disrupt the delicate equilibrium upon which reputation rested. From early childhood, girls were trained to temper enthusiasm. Excitement had to be muted. A raised voice, a quickened step, or an animated expression was corrected gently at first, then firmly reinforced as a breach of decorum. Mothers, governesses, and elder sisters instructed girls in the subtle art of measured response, to observe, to wait, to defer gratification, and to conceal desire. Anticipation was permissible only as it could be hidden beneath calm composure. Eagerness manifested in countless forms, all of which were regulated. At social gatherings, a woman must not arrive too early, lest she appear impatient for attention. She must not linger too long near a suitor, for proximity suggested ambition. Conversation required careful pacing. To respond too quickly indicated excitement or overinvestment. To interject prematurely risked social censure. Even gestures of approval, a nod, a smile, a brief laugh, were to be tempered, discreet, and carefully timed. Courtship amplified these rules. Letters, visits, and conversations with a prospective suitor demanded restraint in both action and tone. A woman who replied too quickly to correspondence, approached too eagerly, or offered overt signs of interest risked scandal. Timing became a measure of virtue. To wait demonstrated self-control, patience, and refinement. To act too soon revealed neediness or impulsivity. A single misstep could taint the perception of character, influencing marriage prospects and social standing. Eagerness also applied to mundane accomplishments. Learning new skills, mastering music, or displaying talent required subtlety. Too obvious pride, too much enthusiasm, or visible enjoyment was read as vanity or immodesty. A woman's demeanor was judged not only for what she could do, but how she presented it. The careful suppression of ambition and desire was required, ensuring that excellence remained impressive yet unobtrusive, admired yet safely contained. Physical comportment reinforced this expectation. Movements were slow and deliberate, steps measured, gestures restrained, breath was shallow, posture composed, and facial expression subdued. Even the body's natural rhythms, blushing, quickened heartbeat, or excitement, were trained to conceal intention. The appearance of eagerness was as much about the control of the body as it was about the mind. Medical and moral commentary reinforced the danger of appearing eager. Women were described as delicate, their nervous systems sensitive to overexertion and excitement. Excessive display of enthusiasm was framed as evidence of instability or poor judgment. Self-restraint was both a moral and physiological imperative. The woman who mastered her desires preserved health, propriety, and reputation simultaneously. Over time, women internalized these lessons to the point that eagerness was almost unrecognizable. Desire, curiosity, and excitement were folded inward, expressed only in the most subtle ways: a fleeting glance, a carefully modulated smile, a quiet acknowledgement. The world saw composure, dignity, and grace, never the pulse of anticipation beneath the surface. In Victorian society, to appear eager was not merely impolite, it was dangerous. It threatened social hierarchy, undermined perception, and exposed vulnerability. A woman's survival depended on mastery of restraint, and the quiet art of tempering desire became one of the most essential skills a young lady could possess. In every glance, gesture, and movement, eagerness was both forbidden and fatal, and the most refined women learned to conceal it as meticulously as they concealed breath, appetite, and emotion. In Victorian high society, courtship was a labyrinth of rules, rituals, and invisible boundaries, yet it was a labyrinth through which women were expected to navigate without true agency. A young woman's consent was assumed, constrained, and often irrelevant in practice. Her role was to perform decorum, exhibit refinement, and display measured interest while suppressing personal desire. The rituals of courtship were tightly regulated, not for the pleasure or autonomy of the woman, but to preserve reputation, family standing, and social hierarchy. From early adolescence, girls were trained to anticipate courtship long before a suitor arrived. Mothers and governesses taught them how to sit, how to smile, how to respond to compliments or conversation. They were instructed in subtle cues: when to lower the gaze, how to tilt the head, how to acknowledge attention without appearing forward. These lessons were designed to prepare them for social interactions in which personal desire was subordinated to propriety. Pleasure was permitted only insofar as it could be concealed, regulated, and socially legible. Courtship itself was a series of performances. Visits were orchestrated, the correct time of day, the appropriate room, the presence of chaperones. Conversation was constrained by rules of phrasing, tone, and content. Laughter, interest, and engagement had to be tempered, moderated, and timed precisely. To show overt enthusiasm was to risk gossip, scandal, or the perception of neediness. A woman's words, gestures, and expressions were all under scrutiny, evaluated not for their sincerity, but for their conformity to expected decorum. The rituals often rendered consent moot. Offers of marriage, proposals, and suggestions of intimacy were framed within strict social codes. A woman could accept or decline, but refusal required careful phrasing, strategic timing, and often the intervention of a third party. Even then, refusal could be socially punished. A prospective suitor might withdraw interest, family expectations could impose pressure, and reputations could be quietly damaged. Women learned that autonomy was conditional, and that obedience, even feigned, was safer than assertion. Physical proximity was tightly regulated. Glances, gestures, and touches were surveilled. A hand lightly extended for greeting, a brush of the arm, a meeting of eyes, each was monitored for implication. Women were taught to respond to attention without initiating it, to acknowledge interest without expressing desire. Consent became a performance, the correct response at the correct moment, never an honest articulation of feeling. Letters, notes, and correspondence mirrored these constraints. Responses had to be timed, phrasing measured, tone tempered. A too quick reply suggested eagerness. Hesitation conveyed coldness. Each word was an instrument of self-restraint, communicating propriety while concealing personal sentiment. In this arena, consent was mediated by language, ritual, and societal expectation rather than desire or preference. Medical and moral discourse reinforced this discipline. Women were described as delicate, impressionable, and prone to excitement or hysteria. Regulation of emotion, behavior, and even response to courtship was framed as protective. To maintain health and virtue, women were to moderate their reactions, suppress impulses, and present themselves as calm and controlled, even in moments of emotional turbulence. Over time, the lessons of courtship became internalized. Women learned to anticipate social cues, to regulate gestures, to measure smiles, to calibrate words. Desire, curiosity, and instinct were folded inward, never allowed to disturb the carefully orchestrated performance. Autonomy was optional. Compliance was survival. In Victorian society, courtship was a stage, and women were performers bound by invisible scripts. Consent existed only as a formal gesture, regulated by etiquette and social expectation. True freedom of choice was rare. The priority was always preservation of reputation. In every glance, movement, and word, women were reminded that the rituals of courtship were theirs to navigate carefully, without transgression, and always without revealing the true rhythm of their own hearts. In the rigid architecture of Victorian society, the word "no" carried a weight far greater than its syllables. For a woman, refusal was a dangerous act, fraught with moral, social, and even familial consequences. Saying no, whether to a proposal, a request, or an invitation, was not merely an exercise of personal will, it was a challenge to the carefully maintained hierarchy of propriety. Every syllable of denial was scrutinized, measured against invisible codes, and potentially weaponized against the speaker. From earliest lessons, girls were taught to temper refusal with tact. Direct rejection was dangerous. Instead, polite deflection, strategic delay, or the use of intermediaries was encouraged. A soft excuse, a carefully chosen phrase, or a subtle change in posture could communicate dissent without overt confrontation. Mothers and governesses drilled these lessons in patience and subtlety, emphasizing that refusal must never appear abrupt, harsh, or resolute. A girl learned that to say no was to step onto a precipice. The misstep could be socially fatal. Courtship amplified the peril. A suitor's attention was expected to be met with gratitude, acknowledgement, and careful engagement, even if the woman had no desire to reciprocate. To reject a proposal outright was to risk gossip, censure, or loss of reputation. Families often intervened, guiding the young woman's response to protect social standing. Even when refusal was justified, it had to be articulated in a manner that preserved dignity, maintained relationships, and minimized offense. The personal will of the woman was subordinated to expectation, appearance, and propriety. Public and private refusals were governed by the same principles. At social gatherings, a woman could not decline invitations too abruptly. At home, she was expected to modulate tone and gesture, ensuring that every denial was tempered with charm and subtlety. A shrug of the shoulders, a lowered gaze, a carefully timed phrase, each could convey a no safely, while direct, blunt words risked suspicion or derision. The performance of refusal became as important as the act itself. Even in matters of daily life, refusal was circumscribed. A woman could not simply decline assistance, resist social expectations, or refuse an unwanted task without consequence. The social hierarchy demanded compliance, and denial was always interpreted through that lens. What might appear a small act of autonomy could be read as moral deficiency, lack of breeding, or improper ambition. Silence or delay was often safer than verbal refusal, a strategy internalized from childhood. Medical and moral authorities of the era reinforced these lessons. Women were described as delicate, impressionable, and prone to emotional excess. A forceful refusal, it was said, could disturb the nerves, provoke anxiety, or disrupt composure. Compliance was framed as both protective and virtuous, while resistance was cast as risky, unladylike, and socially destabilizing. Emotional regulation was not merely decorum, it was morality and health in one. Over time, women internalized this restraint so deeply that denial became almost impossible to express without mediation. Words were carefully chosen, gestures measured, and pauses extended. Even when refusal was necessary, it was softened, indirect, and coded to ensure that autonomy did not provoke scrutiny. The act of saying no became a study in subtlety, a performance of self-discipline disguised as politeness. In Victorian society, refusal was not freedom, it was peril. To assert oneself openly was to risk censure, isolation, and diminished prospects. A woman learned that no could be uttered only with precision, timing, and careful calibration. Even the simplest act of denial demanded strategy, patience, and mastery over both mind and body. In a world defined by surveillance, expectation, and invisible rules, saying no was dangerous, and saying it well was an art of survival. In Victorian high society, an engagement was never merely a private agreement between two individuals. It was a transaction of social currency, a public declaration that a woman's future, her body, and her reputation were now entwined with the will and expectations of others. Engagement was social property, a marker of status and security, and a young woman's autonomy within it was severely constrained. Her consent was assumed, her behavior regulated, and her conduct scrutinized from the moment a proposal was offered. From the earliest lessons, girls were trained to understand the significance of this transition. Marriage was presented as the culmination of refinement, the goal of proper upbringing, and the ultimate test of decorum. Engagement was the liminal space between girlhood and womanhood, a period in which behavior was under constant observation. A young woman's responses, her words, gestures, and expressions were interpreted as proof of her suitability, her virtue, and her understanding of her own social position. Once a proposal was extended, the act of acceptance was laden with ritual. Timing was critical. Immediate acceptance could be read as eagerness, weakness, or lack of self-control. Delay signaled deliberation, discernment, and virtue. A refusal, even polite and justified, could threaten family alliances, provoke scandal, or jeopardize prospects entirely. The woman's consent, while nominally decisive, was constrained by social expectation. To navigate the period of engagement was to perform obedience, patience, and grace under pressure. Engagement transformed daily life into a continuous performance. Visits, letters, and conversations were carefully calibrated to project propriety. Every glance, smile, and gesture was interpreted for hidden meaning. To speak too freely about the engagement risked gossip. To show overt pleasure, interest, or impatience threatened subtle criticism. Even silence, when prolonged, could invite speculation, suggesting doubt, dissatisfaction, or moral weakness. The woman's body and demeanor became instruments of social signaling, conveying correctness as much as feeling. Family oversight was relentless. Parents and guardians monitored interactions, advised on speech, and even mediated correspondence with the future spouse. A young woman's behavior was a reflection not only of her own refinement but of her family's honor. Engagement was therefore a shared property. A woman's agency was circumscribed by the expectations of both her own household and the household of her betrothed. Autonomy was subordinated to the preservation of reputation, alliances, and appearances. Medical and moral guidance reinforced these norms. Women were described as delicate, impressionable, and emotionally sensitive. Displaying impatience, desire, or dissatisfaction during engagement could strain nerves, provoke emotional imbalance, or threaten composure. Silence, restraint, and measured conduct were framed as necessary for both moral and physical well-being. Engagement required discipline, for the act of waiting, observing, and conforming was as critical as the eventual union itself. Even everyday behavior was reshaped. Meals, dress, walking, conversation, all were monitored for appropriateness. A misstep could be interpreted as moral laxity, eagerness, or disregard for propriety. Every interaction became a rehearsal in compliance, a silent negotiation between desire, expectation, and performance. Thus, in Victorian society, engagement was not merely a personal promise, it was social property, a claim staked on reputation, behavior, and conformity. The young woman learned that her future was held collectively by family, society, and circumstance, and that her conduct during this period could enhance or diminish the value of that claim. Autonomy was limited, freedom curtailed, and desire subdued. Engagement demanded perfection, patience, and constant vigilance, for in a single gesture or word, a woman could jeopardize the very life carefully orchestrated for her. In Victorian high society, marriage was far more than a personal union. It was the ultimate stage upon which a woman's obedience, refinement, and self-restraint were tested. The ceremony itself, the courtship leading to it, and the subsequent domestic life were all designed to transform a woman from an individual with desires and inclinations into a carefully contained, socially legible embodiment of propriety. Upon marriage, the self a young woman's preferences, autonomy, and instincts was expected to vanish, replaced by duty, decorum, and conformity to her husband's household and social expectations. From earliest instruction, girls were prepared for this transition. Mothers and governesses emphasized that marriage was both a privilege and a responsibility. It was the culmination of careful upbringing, the ultimate proof of virtue, and the primary route to social security. Women were taught to anticipate the needs, expectations, and oversight of a husband, internalizing the belief that their own desires were secondary to those of the household. The very idea of personal agency was to be moderated, carefully restrained, and rarely acknowledged. The ritual of engagement and marriage was a rehearsal in obedience. Every gesture, expression, and word leading up to the ceremony was scrutinized for hints of autonomy or impropriety. Even the most subtle expression of impatience, preference, or assertiveness could be interpreted as a moral flaw, a threat to the delicate balance of social perception. A bride was not simply a partner. She was a symbol of familial honor, propriety, and control. Her body, her speech, and her comportment were all instruments of representation, bearing the weight of generations of expectation. Once married, the disappearance of self was reinforced through domestic routines. A woman's day was orchestrated around the household, social obligations, and her husband's preferences. Decisions, even those that might have once belonged to her, were now circumscribed. She learned to manage the appearance of contentment, to navigate conversations with diplomacy, and to suppress impulses that could be read as rebellious or inappropriate. Personal desires were quietly subordinated to the maintenance of harmony, reputation, and hierarchy. Physical comportment and emotional restraint remained paramount. The postures, gestures, and expressions that had been rehearsed for parlors and salons became indispensable within the domestic sphere. Appetite, movement, and speech were regulated, not merely for elegance, but to maintain the appearance of submission and compliance. Even the simplest acts, sitting, serving, responding, became performances of restraint, rehearsed and perfected over years. The moral and medical teachings of the era reinforced this suppression. Women were described as delicate, impressionable, and constitutionally nervous. Autonomy, unchecked emotion, or unrestrained thought was framed as dangerous, not only socially, but physiologically. Obedience was cast as protective. Restraint preserved nerves, health, and virtue simultaneously. Marriage was the ultimate context in which this control was both demanded and normalized. Letters, visits, and social interactions were all monitored and mediated by the standards of domestic hierarchy. A woman who attempted to assert preference risked censure, gossip, or the perception of improper ambition. Even personal reflection and thought became a careful negotiation of loyalty, propriety, and invisibility. The self, once vivid and autonomous, was carefully folded into the obligations of the household, subordinated to duty and expectation. In this way, marriage in Victorian society was not simply a union of two individuals, but a system of containment. The bride was expected to vanish within it, leaving only a polished, compliant, and socially legible presence. Autonomy, preference, and instinct were muted. Desire was restrained. Even thought was monitored, subtly reshaped by the pressures of obedience. In every glance, gesture, and whispered word, the married woman learned that survival, dignity, and social success demanded the careful disappearance of the self. In the rigidly orchestrated world of Victorian high society, pregnancy was both inevitable and invisible, a condition simultaneously honored and concealed. For women, it existed as a paradox, a celebrated sign of fertility and virtue, yet a private matter shrouded in silence and circumspection. To be visibly pregnant was to risk gossip, speculation, and scrutiny. To acknowledge the condition openly was considered improper. In this society, the body could bear life, but it could never announce it freely. From the moment of marriage, women were instructed in the subtle management of appearance, posture, and movement, as these became instruments of discretion during pregnancy. The swelling of the body was masked by layers of fabric, tightly corseted bodices, and voluminous skirts. Patterns of dress and draping were carefully chosen to conceal the growing form. Even subtle shifts in gait or posture, the natural consequences of pregnancy, were moderated and adjusted to preserve decorum. A misstep, a rounded silhouette, or an unguarded gesture could invite speculation, undermining the careful projection of propriety the woman had cultivated for years. Social interaction was profoundly affected. A pregnant woman remained visible yet invisible. She could attend gatherings, participate in conversation, and maintain appearances, but any sign of fatigue, discomfort, or bodily need had to be muted. Breathlessness was disguised with subtle composure, nausea with silence, swelling with careful choice of costume and posture. The body, while performing its natural function, was required to remain socially legible, a delicate balance between life and restraint. Medical guidance reinforced this silence. Pregnancy was framed as a delicate condition requiring supervision, moderation, and control. Women were instructed to avoid excessive movement, public exertion, or overt display of discomfort. The discourse of health merged seamlessly with that of propriety. Concealment, restraint, and patience were both virtuous and necessary for survival. Any breach of decorum, even accidental, could be interpreted as recklessness, impropriety, or deficiency in moral fortitude. Communication, too, was mediated. The condition was rarely spoken of openly, even within families. References to bodily changes were couched in euphemism, indirect phrasing, or complete omission. Letters and conversation avoided direct acknowledgement. Knowledge was shared only among trusted confidantes. Silence became a form of protection, not merely of social standing, but of the woman's autonomy within the rigid hierarchy of expectation. Pregnancy also carried moral symbolism. To carry life was celebrated as proof of virtue, obedience, and proper conduct. Yet, the public acknowledgement of the body's transformation risked breaching the line between admiration and scandal. The physical evidence of motherhood, while natural, was treated as delicate, secret, and carefully moderated. Women were expected to maintain control over both the body that gestated and the perception of that body within society. Over time, these lessons were internalized. Many women developed the skill of invisibility, concealing fatigue, discomfort, and desire, even while performing the most extraordinary physiological labor. Social survival demanded that pregnancy be managed as a private spectacle, carefully choreographed to align with expectation, decorum, and virtue. Thus, pregnancy in Victorian society was not merely a condition, it was a performance of restraint, discretion, and propriety. Women learned to inhabit their changing bodies with subtlety, concealing need and discomfort, modulating presence, and preserving dignity. To be pregnant was to carry both life and expectation, to navigate the invisible boundaries of observation while fulfilling nature's demands, and to ensure that even the most extraordinary transformation could remain socially invisible. In Victorian high society, illness was never simply a physical condition, it was a performance, a carefully mediated display of delicacy and refinement. For women, to be unwell was to navigate a landscape of observation, judgment, and expectation. Every cough, every pallor, every tremor was noted, every gesture of discomfort measured against the invisible standards of propriety. Illness was permitted, but only if it could be executed with grace, subtlety, and discretion. From early education, girls were taught that weakness and suffering were to be concealed wherever possible. Pain could not be allowed to dominate a room, nor to draw attention to the body's demands. A woman who moaned, groaned, or made overt signs of distress risked being deemed hysterical, immoderate, or morally deficient. The faintest sign of illness required careful management. A tilt of the head, a slow step, a hand delicately rested on a chair, all coordinated to convey fragility without impropriety. Even the act of visiting a physician was a regulated ritual. Women were expected to maintain composure, suppress panic, and articulate symptoms with poise. Exaggeration was as dangerous as understatement. To appear too weak invited condescension, while appearing too robust risked disbelief or social criticism. The body itself became a medium for social negotiation. Visible symptoms were permitted only insofar as they confirmed refinement, delicacy, or feminine sensibility. Public settings imposed additional constraints. To cough, sneeze, or otherwise reveal the body's needs required subtlety. A handkerchief must be held gracefully, the motion of covering the mouth practiced and precise. Even the tilt of the head while seated or standing was significant. Social observers, ever attuned to decorum, interpreted bodily behavior as evidence of character, upbringing, and adherence to expectation. A woman's reputation could be quietly undermined by mismanaged symptoms or visible discomfort. Medical and moral discourse reinforced these lessons. Women were described as constitutionally delicate, prone to nervousness, and at risk from excessive exertion or emotion. Fragility was not only a social expectation but a medical imperative. Doctors prescribed moderation, restraint, and attention to appearance. Rest, light exercise, and careful observation were framed as virtuous acts, preserving both health and social propriety. Illness became an arena in which compliance, self-control, and grace were both morally and physically necessary. Even within private spaces, illness demanded performance. Family members observed posture, tone, and movement. Symptoms were monitored, corrected, and managed. Women internalized these expectations so thoroughly that even minor ailments were navigated with careful choreography. A faint smile to mask discomfort, a measured breath to conceal fatigue, a controlled gesture to indicate need without vulnerability. Pain and distress became instruments of refinement, shaped and moderated to maintain appearance. The consequences of failing to perform illness correctly could be subtle, but significant. A woman who displayed suffering too vividly risked gossip, rumor, and social marginalization. A slight exaggeration suggested hysteria. Too little acknowledgement of discomfort suggested unrefined stoicism or moral weakness. Illness, like emotion, appetite, or movement, became another field in which a woman's mastery over body and perception was tested. Thus, in the drawing rooms, parlors, and salons of Victorian England, illness was never neutral. It was a demonstration of decorum, an exercise in self-discipline, and a mirror of social expectation. Women learned to endure, conceal, and articulate discomfort with precision. Pain was permitted, but only when elegant, discreet, and carefully measured. In this society, even sickness became a stage upon which a woman's refinement, morality, and control were relentlessly examined. In Victorian high society, fainting was perhaps the only socially sanctioned interruption of composure. Where tears, breath, and gesture were constrained, and where even the subtlest expression of desire or discomfort was monitored, the act of collapsing briefly into unconsciousness offered a peculiar form of reprieve. It was a ritualized surrender, a socially legible escape from expectation, danger, or impropriety, a momentary suspension in which the rigid codes of decorum could bend without scandal. From girlhood, women were taught that the body could betray them, and that these betrayals required careful management. Yet fainting occupied a curious exception. It was both involuntary and permissible. A sudden swoon was understood as a signal of fragility, delicacy, or moral sensitivity. It conformed to the societal image of womanhood, physically delicate, emotionally responsive, and constitutionally nervous. Unlike anger, excessive laughter, or visible appetite, fainting did not reflect a lapse in judgment. It reinforced the aesthetic of refinement and submission. The act itself required subtle performance, even within its appearance of spontaneity. A woman might allow a hand to rest lightly against a table or a chair, tilt the head gently, and sink to the floor or onto a nearby seat. The movement had to appear natural, yet composed. Limpness, slowness, and grace were all carefully modulated. A truly uncontrolled collapse would be shocking. A carefully executed feint suggested vulnerability, refinement, and social awareness. Observers, trained to read nuance, interpreted the swoon as both a physical and moral signal. The woman's fragility was authentic, yet her demeanor remained exemplary. Context was critical. Fainting was often invoked during social gatherings, courtships, or moments of intense emotional display. The heat of crowded rooms, the excitement of attention, or the shock of startling news could precipitate a swoon, providing a socially acceptable pause. It was a form of control disguised as surrender. The woman remained in compliance with societal expectation while temporarily escaping its pressures. In this way, fainting functioned as a sanctioned rebellion, an outward loss of control that affirmed, paradoxically, the discipline and propriety of the individual. Medical and moral authorities codified fainting as both natural and virtuous. Women were described as constitutionally delicate, their nervous systems exquisitely sensitive to stimuli. Swooning was framed as evidence of refinement, a sign that the body responded to emotional and environmental pressures in accordance with social norms. Doctors offered guidance on how to recover gracefully, support the body, steady the limbs, and resume composure without overt display. The faint became a form of theatre in which morality, health, and decorum intersected. Even the consequences of a faint were socially mediated. Sympathy, attention, and protection followed the act, yet only if performed within expectation. An unconvincing feint, or one that appeared rehearsed or exaggerated, could provoke suspicion, ridicule, or gossip. The performance had to be precise, convincing enough to suggest vulnerability, delicate enough to maintain dignity, and brief enough to restore social equilibrium. Over time, women internalized this ritual. Many learned to anticipate moments when fainting might be appropriate, to modulate body and breath, to control eyes and hands in advance. The body became an instrument of social negotiation, capable of signaling delicacy and sensitivity while offering a temporary reprieve from the unyielding demands of etiquette. Thus, in the gaslit salons, drawing rooms, and promenades of Victorian England, fainting was the only socially sanctioned surrender of composure. It offered escape without reproach, vulnerability without consequence, and relief without scandal. It was a discipline disguised as weakness, a performance that allowed women to navigate the relentless pressures of society while maintaining the illusion of refinement and moral propriety. In a world where almost every gesture, breath, and glance was surveilled, fainting provided a fleeting sanctuary, a delicate, suspended moment in which the rules could bend, if only briefly. In Victorian high society, the administration of medicine was as much a matter of social control as it was of health. Women were described as delicate, nervous, and constitutionally fragile, their bodies prone to weakness and their minds easily unsettled. Within this framework, medical intervention, whether in the form of prescribed tinctures, powders, or ether, was not merely restorative. It was a tool for maintaining social order, reinforcing obedience, and ensuring compliance with the unyielding rules of propriety. From adolescence onward, young women were conditioned to accept treatment without question. Physicians, often men of authority and considerable social influence, prescribed remedies for the body and, implicitly, the mind. Laudanum, ether, and other opiates were common. They dulled discomfort, quieted anxiety, and regulated emotional expression. Compliance was both expected and morally framed. A woman who resisted treatment risked being labeled difficult, hysterical, or immoderate. Acceptance of medical advice became another measure of refinement and obedience, a demonstration that the body, like behavior, could be controlled. The administration of medicine was highly ritualized. Syringes, spoons, and small cups were handled with precision, often accompanied by strict instructions regarding timing, dosage, and frequency. Women were expected to follow these instructions exactly, without complaint or deviation. Even minor mistakes, taking a dose too early, swallowing too quickly, or showing discomfort during administration, were seen as lapses in self-discipline. The body was, in effect, trained to obey, and the mind conditioned to accept authority silently. Ether, in particular, exemplified the intersection of medicine and social control. Administered in controlled settings, It soothed nerves, eased pain, and subdued emotional volatility. Its use in domestic and clinical contexts ensured that women could endure both physiological strain and the demands of etiquette. An unsteady hand, a flushed face, or a quickened breath, visible signs of human vulnerability, were mitigated by chemical assistance, restoring an outward composure that aligned with societal expectations. The drug rendered compliance effortless, yet the appearance of serenity remained socially legible. Medical authority also reinforced moral lessons. Women were described as prone to hysteria, overexcitement, or physical imbalance, and treatment was framed as both protective and corrective. The subduing of the body was interpreted as evidence of virtue, refinement, and moral fitness. To accept treatment gracefully was to demonstrate decorum. To resist was to signal disorder, impropriety, or instability. In this way, the administration of medicine extended the social regulation of the female body, merging health, morality, and hierarchy into a single, ritualized practice. Even in the home, the lessons of compliance were relentless. Caregivers, mothers, and nurses ensured that treatment was administered precisely, reinforcing the notion that obedience to medical instruction was synonymous with refinement. Women internalized this regulation so completely that they often managed their own care with meticulous precision, monitoring dosage, timing, and effect, all while maintaining composure and silence. Their bodies became instruments of both health and social conformity. Over time, the link between medicine and compliance extended beyond individual treatment. The culture of medical authority taught women to moderate appetite, movement, emotion, and desire in anticipation of intervention. The body was disciplined chemically, the mind instructed to obey, and the outward appearance maintained at all times. Pain, discomfort, and physiological need were acknowledged only as far as etiquette permitted. Treatment masked the rest. Thus, in Victorian society, medicine, ether, and opiates were more than remedies, they were instruments of subtle control. Women learned to accept them with quiet compliance, reinforcing the social architecture of restraint, obedience, and refinement. Pain could be dulled, nerves soothed, and emotion tempered, all while the outward display of decorum remained intact. In this way, chemical intervention became inseparable from etiquette, a tool that ensured the body, like behavior, remained perfectly contained. In Victorian high society, reputation was less a reflection of truth than a fragile, invisible construct, one that governed every glance, gesture, and word. For women, it was a cage both omnipresent and imperceptible, enclosing behavior, thought, and even feeling. A woman's social survival depended not merely on what she did, but on how it was perceived. The slightest misstep could ripple through drawing rooms, promenades, and salons, creating consequences that lingered long after the moment had passed. From earliest lessons, girls were taught to anticipate scrutiny. Mothers, governesses, and elder sisters emphasized that appearance of composure, modesty, and refinement was inseparable from virtue. Behavior was monitored for subtle transgressions, a glance that lingered, a smile that appeared too freely, a gesture that betrayed desire or impatience. Reputation was built not on truth, but on adherence to social expectation, and even innocence offered no immunity from interpretation. The invisible cage extended to every domain of life. Movement, speech, dress, and posture were all constrained by the fear of misperception. To fidget was thoughtless, to blush, suggestive, to speak too boldly, impertinent. Even acts of kindness were scrutinized, for generosity could be read as calculation, charity as ambition. A woman's conduct was evaluated continuously, her body and behavior surveilled by peers, family, and acquaintances alike. Each interaction was an opportunity to reinforce or jeopardize her standing. Courtship and marriage heightened this pressure. Words and gestures that might be acceptable in private became fraught in public. A letter, a glance, a prompt reply all carried potential consequences. A suitor's perception could determine opportunity, and the interpretation of friends and family could reinforce or undermine it. A single indiscretion, real or imagined, could limit options, tarnish social standing, or provoke gossip that would echo through salons for years. Medical and moral authority reinforced this invisible prison. Women were described as delicate, morally impressionable, and constitutionally fragile. Deviations from composure, visible excitement, emotional display, or bodily indulgence were interpreted as weakness or moral deficiency. Discipline of the self in every domain became a protective measure, a way to preserve both health and social viability. Restraint was not simply decorum, it was survival. Even private behavior was constrained by reputation. A woman internalized the watchful gaze of society, censoring gestures, thoughts, and expressions before they could escape. Emotional impulse, appetite, curiosity, and desire were moderated, filtered, and often suppressed. Self-control became instinctive, a constant negotiation between instinct and expectation. In this way, the invisible cage existed not only in social space, but within the mind and body of the woman herself. Gossip, subtle observation, and societal commentary reinforced the power of this invisible cage. Whispers traveled through households, at promenades, and across salons. Stories, embellished or imagined, carried consequences disproportionate to action. The cage was maintained collectively by peers, family, and the wider society, all enforcing conformity through quiet pressure rather than overt decree. Over time, women came to inhabit this cage unconsciously. Every movement, expression, and word was calibrated, anticipating judgment that might never arrive. Liberty, spontaneity, and unguarded emotion were sacrificed to preserve social survival. The body, like the mind, became an instrument of vigilance, perpetually monitored for signs of transgression. Thus, in Victorian society, reputation was both shield and prison. It conferred opportunity, influence, and respect, yet demanded constant surveillance and self-restraint. Women learned to navigate its invisible walls with care, mastering gestures, speech, and thought to survive socially. In this way, reputation became the ultimate measure of conformity, a silent, omnipresent cage from which few could escape, yet all were compelled to inhabit. In Victorian high society, gossip was far more than idle chatter. It was a subtle instrument of judgment, a mechanism for enforcing conformity, and, in its most insidious forms, a tool for social execution. For women, whose behavior was constantly surveilled, gossip functioned as both mirror and executioner, reflecting perceived flaws and punishing those who failed to maintain the rigid standards of propriety. Every glance, gesture, or word carried potential repercussions, whispered and magnified through salons, drawing rooms, and promenades. From early girlhood, women were taught that the eyes and ears of society were everywhere. Mothers and governesses emphasized that missteps, however minor, were rarely private. A poorly timed remark, a hastened step, an uncontrolled laugh, each could become fodder for observation and comment. The lesson was clear. One's behavior was never solely personal. It was public property, perpetually open to scrutiny. Gossip ensured that no breach of expectation went unnoticed, and that social norms were enforced without the necessity of formal authority. The subtle power of gossip lay in its efficiency. It did not rely on confrontation, argument, or punishment. Instead, it operated through suggestion, repetition, and social consensus. A whispered word, a raised eyebrow, A knowing glance could circulate through circles of peers, growing in detail and significance with each retelling. A single error, real or imagined, could be transformed into a narrative that marked a woman as forward, frivolous, or immodest. In a society where reputation was fragile, gossip functioned as an invisible court, delivering verdicts without trial. Courtship and engagement were particularly vulnerable to scrutiny. Conversations, gestures, and correspondence were analyzed for hidden meaning. Did a blush signify eagerness or propriety? Was a prompt reply evidence of enthusiasm or weakness? The answers were interpreted not by the individual involved, but by the collective judgment of observers, who then disseminated their conclusions through whispers and subtle commentary. A single rumor could diminish marital prospects or tarnish social standing for years. Even domestic behavior was subject to gossip. The handling of servants, the arrangement of meals, the subtle management of household etiquette, all could provoke comment if perceived as improper. A woman's appearance, her posture, or the perceived emotional state of her family became material for discussion. Gossip reinforced the invisible hierarchy. Compliance was rewarded with admiration and respect. Deviation punished with subtle exclusion, censure, or rumor. Medical and moral discourses reinforced the fear of exposure. Women were described as constitutionally delicate and socially impressionable. The consequences of public scrutiny were framed as threats to both nerves and moral character. Compliance, discretion, and the careful management of appearance were taught as safeguards against the corrosive effects of gossip. In essence, self-restraint became survival, and vigilance over every gesture, expression, and word was a moral duty. Over time, women internalized this surveillance. Even in private, they censored themselves, anticipating how actions might be interpreted and shared. Spontaneous behavior was tempered, pleasure was muted, emotional expression calculated. Gossip, once external, became internalized as a constant mental tribunal, a subtle and relentless monitor of propriety. Thus, in Victorian society, gossip was not mere entertainment, it was social execution, a silent yet formidable enforcer of conformity. It maintained order without laws, punished without physical force, and regulated behavior with unmatched subtlety. Women learned early that survival required mastery not only of etiquette, but of perception itself, navigating a world where whispers could wound more effectively than any overt sanction. The social web was both protective and perilous, and gossip was its most efficient, insidious mechanism. In Victorian high society, the weight of expectation was immense, and every gesture, glance, and word was measured against invisible standards of propriety. Yet beneath the rigid surface of etiquette, women occasionally discovered the subtle art of transgression. To break the rules slowly, incrementally, with care was a dangerous but necessary exercise in asserting autonomy within the confines of social expectation. Such deviations were not overt rebellion, they were whispers of freedom, performed with calculation, subtlety, and discretion. From childhood, girls were instructed in obedience and restraint. Every movement, posture, and expression was monitored, corrected, and molded into an ideal of refinement. But as women matured, some began to recognize the elasticity hidden within these rules. They observed how a slightly relaxed posture, a carefully timed smile, or a glance held fractionally longer could communicate independence without provoking censure. The lesson was delicate. Compliance remained essential, but mastery included knowing where and how small deviations could be tolerated. Breaking rules slowly required an acute awareness of perception. Women learned to test boundaries with precision, gauging the reactions of family, peers, and potential suitors. A softened constraint of posture might go unnoticed if executed subtly. A slightly faster pace in walking could suggest vigor without implying immodesty. Even conversation could be gently expanded. A carefully phrased opinion, a nuanced observation, or a discreetly witty remark might hint at intellect and personality without breaching decorum. Every act of transgression was rehearsed mentally, measured against the potential consequences, and executed with care. Courtship provided the clearest arena for these minor acts of autonomy. A woman could allow a fleeting look, a carefully orchestrated touch of the hand, or a subtle pause in conversation to signal preference, interest, or humor. These gestures, when controlled and timed with precision, conveyed meaning without attracting scandal. The challenge was that the social audience was ever present. Family, friends, and even the suitor himself observed, interpreted, and judged. One misstep could undo careful subversion, yet a well-calculated deviation could demonstrate intelligence, charm, and self-possession. Even the domestic sphere became a site for measured defiance. A woman could manage the household in ways that asserted taste, control, and judgment without overtly challenging authority. She could bend expectations of routine, display subtle individuality in dress, or guide conversation to reflect personal interests, all while maintaining the appearance of submission and propriety. These small acts, invisible to casual observation, were exercises in psychological and social negotiation. Medical and moral guidance emphasized restraint, yet implicitly recognized its limits. Women were described as delicate, impressionable, and constitutionally sensitive. Emotional and physical discipline was necessary for survival. Yet the very training that demanded compliance also equipped women with the skills to navigate boundaries, to bend rules without shattering the social order, and to assert subtle agency. Obedience became a canvas for covert artistry, and deviation a disciplined skill. Over time, many women became adept at this quiet rebellion. Their autonomy was hidden in gesture, tone, and timing. The body, voice, and expression were instruments of subtle negotiation. Desire, intellect, and emotion were folded into controlled performance, visible only in imperceptible increments. The breaking of rules became an exercise in precision, bold enough to assert individuality, delicate enough to avoid censure. Thus, in Victorian society, transgression was not sudden or dramatic. It was incremental, calculated, and almost invisible. Women learned that survival required obedience, but mastery required subtle rebellion. Every measured deviation reinforced the paradox of Victorian womanhood. The body, mind, and expression were bound by expectation, yet the careful bending of these rules allowed freedom to persist quietly in the shadows of observation. In the gilded drawing rooms and perfumed salons of Victorian high society, etiquette was rarely what it appeared to be. To the casual observer, it seemed merely a code of manners, proper posture, measured speech, and refined behavior. Yet beneath this surface, etiquette served a deeper, more insidious purpose. It was not only about grace or appearance, it was about control, surveillance, and the shaping of women into instruments of social order. Every glance, gesture, and breath was governed, not for the comfort of the individual, but to preserve hierarchy, propriety, and the illusion of moral superiority. From early childhood, girls were trained in the rituals of etiquette as if they were sacred duties. Every movement, how to sit, how to stand, how to hold a fan, was rehearsed, corrected, and internalized. The purpose was rarely framed as oppression. It was presented as refinement, as preparation for social life, and as a demonstration of virtue. Yet in practice, etiquette functioned as a subtle tool of governance, ensuring that women's bodies, emotions, and choices remained predictable, controlled, and socially legible. The lessons of etiquette were woven into every aspect of life. Posture demonstrated discipline, glances communicated humility, controlled speech signaled moral rectitude. These behaviors were not arbitrary. They were markers by which society could evaluate character. A slip of the hand, a hasty laugh, or a misaligned gaze could be interpreted as evidence of weakness, impropriety, or unworthiness. Etiquette imposed a constant self-surveillance, compelling women to monitor themselves as meticulously as others observed them. Courtship and marriage were central arenas for the exercise of etiquette's hidden authority. Women were expected to perform charm, patience, and responsiveness, while suppressing desire, impatience, or autonomy. Compliance with these rules was rewarded with admiration and opportunity. Deviation risked gossip, diminished prospects, or even social exile. In this way, etiquette operated less as guidance for comfort or civility, and more as a mechanism for controlling access, behavior, and influence. The domestic sphere reinforced the same principles. Household management, interaction with servants, correspondence, and social visits all demanded adherence to a subtle choreography. A woman's ability to navigate these domains successfully reflected not only competence, but moral fortitude and social intelligence. Etiquette trained her to anticipate judgment, to calibrate response, and to conceal impulses that might threaten reputation or harmony. In effect, social grace became a mode of survival, teaching compliance as a form of self-preservation. Medical and moral authorities further legitimized the system. Women were described as delicate, impressionable, and constitutionally sensitive. The rigorous discipline of etiquette was framed as protective, preserving nerves, health, and moral virtue. Every restraint on movement, speech, appetite, or emotion was cast as necessary, beneficial, and even natural. The body and mind were both molded to conform to social expectation, ensuring predictability and control. Over time, women internalized these lessons. Politeness became instinctive, restraint automatic. The performance of virtue, compliance, and refinement was no longer external. It resided within, shaping thought, feeling, and instinct. Desire, curiosity, and autonomy were folded into careful observation, subtle negotiation, and discreet conformity. Etiquette was not just a set of rules, it was the architecture of control, etched into mind and body alike. In truth, Victorian etiquette was never about comfort or ease. It was about dominance, the shaping of women into compliant, disciplined, and socially legible beings. It enforced hierarchy, regulated desire, and masked control beneath the veneer of refinement. Every gesture, glance, and breath was a reminder that social order demanded obedience. Behind every curtsy, every controlled smile, every carefully modulated word lay the quiet assertion of authority. Etiquette, in its essence, was not decorum, it was discipline, the invisible hand that guided, contained, and constrained the female body and mind, ensuring that women moved through the world exactly as society demanded. Even as the gaslights dimmed and the corsets loosened, the echoes of Victorian etiquette continued to resonate, leaving invisible traces on the lives of women long after the era that birthed them had passed. The lessons of restraint, concealment, and perpetual observation, once drilled into every gesture, glance, and breath, became woven into the very consciousness of successive generations. The rules that governed posture, speech, appetite, and emotion did not vanish with the decline of formal society. They migrated, subtle and persistent, into modern expectations, leaving a shadow of compliance over women's freedom and expression. From childhood, the legacy of restraint persists. Girls are taught to temper enthusiasm, moderate expression, and anticipate judgment, much as Victorian mothers and governesses once instructed daughters. The same careful choreography of glance, gesture, and voice is silently rehearsed. The pressure to perform calm, composed, and agreeable femininity remains, albeit in subtler forms. Early lessons in politeness, measured speech, and decorous behavior carry echoes of an era when deviation could provoke whispered condemnation, diminished opportunity, or outright social exile. Even modern courtship reflects the lingering influence of these rules. Women are still conditioned to modulate desire, temper enthusiasm, and present interest with careful calculation. Social media, like the parlor and promenade of the past, functions as a stage upon which every word, image, and interaction is scrutinized, judged, and interpreted. Quick replies, emotive responses, or visible excitement are often evaluated in moralized or social terms. Desire remains constrained, not by corset or gown, but by the surveillance of peers, family, and society at large. Timing, presentation, and discretion continue to carry weight far beyond intention. The expectations surrounding professional behavior, dress, and posture also bear the imprint of Victorian discipline. Women are taught to manage their appearance meticulously, to moderate voice and expression, and to navigate hierarchical structures with caution. Initiative, confidence, and ambition must be balanced with restraint. A misstep too loud, too assertive, too visible can provoke judgment, echoing the same principles that once governed curtsies, glances, and faint smiles in candlelit drawing rooms. Composure is still equated with virtue, obedience with propriety. Medical and psychological discourse has transformed, but retains faint echoes of earlier ideology. Women's behavior is monitored, categorized, and often pathologized. Emotional expression is tempered, both socially and clinically, with residual expectations that women regulate desire, fear, and anger carefully. The internalization of observation, once a survival mechanism within salons and parlors, continues, shaping thought, behavior, and self-perception. Women remain, in subtle ways, their own monitors, adjusting instinctively to unseen eyes. Yet these echoes also carry resilience. The very skills of subtlety, observation, and controlled performance that Victorian etiquette demanded have become tools of navigation, empowerment, and subtle agency. Women have learned to bend, negotiate, and manipulate perception, using the lessons of restraint not only for survival, but for influence. Mastery of behavior, once enforced externally, is now wielded as a form of strategic autonomy, a way to inhabit spaces still constrained by social expectation. Ultimately, the rules of Victorian society endure because they were internalized so completely. The lessons of breath, gaze, gesture, appetite, and speech remain embedded in cultural consciousness. They shape how women present themselves, measure desire, and navigate interaction. The world has changed. Gaslights have been replaced by electric bulbs, corsets by fashion, salons by digital spaces. But the architecture of compliance, observation, and subtle negotiation persists. In every glance carefully lowered, every word carefully measured, every gesture carefully modulated, the echo of Victorian rules whispers still, a reminder that even after centuries, society's gaze never truly disappears.